Nearly 2,000 years ago, Jesus walked the earth and spoke like no man had ever spoken before or ever since. Among his famous words are the Sermon on the Mount, the parables, and Matthew 24, the warnings of the signs of the end of the age. Today we're going to do a deep dive on Matthew 24 because many people do not understand these important words and they veer either to the left or to the right with preterism or futurism. We're going to be honest with Jesus' words in the context of both scripture and history. Welcome to the show, everybody. You're listening to the Dance of Life podcast, and I'm your host, as always, Tudor Alexander. Welcome to this very important episode. A lot of people have asked me over the months and years questions about Matthew 24. Hey, are you going to do a walkthrough? Do you have a walkthrough, etc., etc.? And I realized, although I have talked about this topic in other series, like my End Time series or news updates or, whatever else, because Matthew 24 is an easy one to reference in various contexts of eschatology and news updates. I've talked about Matthew 24, but I never really had a complete walkthrough, especially because there's a very important section in there, which we'll get to, that especially now, because of the rise of preterism and Satan's little season, a lot of people are very confused because of these theories that are going around in the world. So they want to know, what is this generation? Who is this generation? And what does Jesus mean specifically by this verse, which we'll get to in today's video? What does he mean by this generation shall not pass away until all these things are fulfilled? Does that call into question every single thing that we've believed with historicism, with amillennialism, with amillennial historicism specifically? Does that destroy our thesis with Jesus' own words, or is there something more to the story as usual? And of course, we're dealing with God, and God speaks in very multidimensional ways and very interesting ways, so we have to think outside of the box and not limit God to a very microcosm of meaning, but rather see something much more profound is going on. So I was motivated to put a walkthrough, complete walkthrough, verse by verse, of this very important chapter, and we're going to do that today. I have lots of walkthroughs on Revelation, on Daniel, on 2 Thessalonians. We have different walkthroughs, but Matthew 24, I never made a walkthrough, and it's very important, very, very important, because it's one of the key end times texts. And right now it's very hotly debated, like I said, because of the rise of these various false eschatologies like preterism or Satan's little season, unfortunately. Even dispensationalists have their own way of weaponizing it, obviously, to prove the rapture. Like one person is going to be taken away, one person is going to be left, etc., etc. We'll get to that as well, those sections, because those sections are not about the rapture. If you haven't guessed already, they're not about the rapture. They're actually about the wicked. It's a completely opposite interpretation. So we want to get this topic right. We want to do it justice. And my goal for you today is to have a very comprehensive, as usual, comprehensive resource on this topic that you can study, that you can use for your own presentations with your own friends, for your own home groups, home Bible studies, whatever that happens to be. Today we're going to go verse by verse, in verse chunks, little verse chunks, obviously, but still verse by verse. And we're going to look at this text from the context that it's in, and also from the overall context of Scripture and history. All three of those matter. The immediate context, the context of Scripture as a whole, especially considering other end times texts like Revelation, Daniel, Thessalonians, etc., and history, because the Bible is meant to be interpreted historically. The prophecies of Scripture are interpreted historically. Now, with that in mind, make sure you smash that like button, subscribe, leave a nice comment of what you learned, hopefully. Also, some very, very big news if you missed my post about the Fennec chatbot, Ask Fennec. If you missed the post about that, go check it out. It's on the website, or I think I probably posted it on my YouTube channel as well. It's a project I've been working on for quite a while. Very, very much work, hundreds and hundreds of hours of work, at least 300 hours to put it together. That's not including all of the other AI things that I've done to structure my data and to have it ready. This chatbot, it's a companion, it's an AI companion. It's very, very cool. It's trained on over 1,000 hours of my content and counting as I make new things. I will train it on that content so it acts as a reference assistant. It's also trained on 1,000 questions, meaning it can serve you quiz questions, it can serve you discussion questions that people have asked me, and then you can answer, and it can test you and see how you do. It's got 3 different modes: librarian, discussion, and quiz mode. It's a phenomenal resource. It is an absolutely phenomenal resource for students of all levels. Whatever you happen to, if you're just beginning and this is all really overwhelming, or if you're really advanced and you do lots of research yourself, it's a great perk. And it's a perk for members, though. It costs $5 a month or $50 a year to be a member on the website. And if you're a member there, that will transition into the ledger that allows you to log in and use this precious resource. Of course, it is a paid membership because it costs money to create and maintain. Lots of money, actually, believe it or not. So either way, it's a paid membership perk, but nevertheless, I don't think that's too much to ask. $5 a month for everything that you get. You basically get to leverage thousands of hours of work that I've put together to create this library and make it incredibly accessible. So check out my post about it. Read all about it. You can also, I'll probably be putting a link at the bottom of the video on the thumbnail or whatever on the cover with the website. It's fennec.danceoflife.com. fennec.danceoflife.com. Now, with that said, my position on end times events is called amillennial historicism. That's a position that I have not seen really anybody else hold. It's not a documented position. It's a very unique position. It is amillennial and it's historicist. It's 2 things together that most people maybe did not see that go together, when in fact they actually go together perfectly. So amillennial historicism, if you want to know what that is, then watch my video on it by that title. This is the lens that I'm going to be looking through when we're going to do the verse-by-verse breakdown and in general. And I believe it's the most honest and consistent with the evidence, with scripture, with history. It is the most consistent perspective. And again, I'm not going to be defending that here because I have got hundreds and hundreds of hours of defenses, notwithstanding the video that I just cited. But the basic idea, excuse me, the basic idea is that you have 2 things. Amillennialism, where Jesus is ruling right now, not in the past in some Tartarian golden age or some future golden age. He's ruling right now in heaven. He's sovereign. And while that's happening, prophecy is unfolding historically fulfilled prophecies. Not something completely limited to the past, not something completely limited to the future, but rather throughout time. That's the basic gist. And I think it's very, very simple, very, very profound, and very consistent with everything else. That means that we see a couple of very key things when we look at prophecy. So what do we see? Well, we see dual or multiple fulfillments in things. We are not just limiting things literally to past or future events like dispensationalists do, or like Satan's little season people do, or preterists do. We look at things having multiple layers of fulfillment. That also means that we see history as a second witness, and we don't drift into over-spiritualized metaphors or total historical revision like Satan's little season theory. We use history and we believe that God is sovereign over time and has preserved history in order to confirm the word that he gave to people like John and Daniel and everyone else, and Paul, or Matthew 24. In this case, the word that he gave directly. God is sovereign over time, and just as he has preserved his word, his written word, he's also preserved history, not all of it, but enough to confirm what he has said. That is a fundamental belief. And of course, that means ultimately that amillennial historicism is grounded in God's sovereignty. Very, very important. So make sure you go watch that video if you haven't yet. And watch the various eschatological series that I've put together to get a full defense, like my End Time series, The Great Delusion, Synagogue of Satan, etc., etc., etc. I have hundreds and hundreds of hours of these materials on my channel. Probably half of my entire library, give or take, including the news updates, is end times related eschatological material. The other half is probably, theology studies, encouragement, that kind of stuff. So it's a nice, good mix. But I am assuming, if you're watching this video, that you have some exposure to eschatology. I'm going to assume that. This is not necessarily a baby beginner's video. I'm just going to assume that you have some exposure to eschatology and maybe even some exposure to my videos already. You don't need to have these things necessarily to learn something today. We're going to make it as simple as possible, but I'm also not going to defend every single thing that I claim, because I've already done that in many other places. So if you are new or old or experienced or not experienced and you disagree with something, then I invite you lovingly to go look at the evidence for that in my other places. I'm going to do my best to explain what I can in this particular episode, but nevertheless, I'm not going to defend everything. Now, why does preterism and futurism both fail? That's a very important thing to begin with. Before we jump into the verse-by-verse breakdown, we have to address this elephant in the room. That elephant in the room is that the predominant way of explaining Matthew 24 and other places is either some form of preterism or some form of futurism. And these two things are at war with each other in people's minds, but people don't realize this is a dialectic. It's an invented dialectic by the Jesuits in order to take your attention off of the real way of interpreting these scriptures, which is historicism. Both preterism and futurism fail for various reasons, but really it boils down to the same thing, which is funny, even though they appear to be very opposite of each other. Both of them rely on literal hermeneutics. Both do not see nuance in interpretation, and both do not read in context of the eschatology landscape as a whole, i.e., Revelation and Daniel specifically. Jesus cites Daniel in his discourse on Matthew 24, specifically the abomination of desolation. So we must understand Daniel in order to understand Matthew 24. Does that make sense? Jesus links Daniel to his speech, his discussion. Therefore, it behooves us to understand what does Daniel mean by things like the little horn, the abomination of desolation, the 1260 period, etc. All of that is now brought into. It's imported into the context. So in order to understand Daniel, you have to first understand the primary prophecy in Daniel, which is the prophecy of Jesus' arrival to the earth, which is the 70 weeks prophecy. Now, do you see how all of this comes back to Jesus, which is such a phenomenal way that he links it to himself? The 70 weeks prophecy is probably the strongest proof. I mean, there's so many, but if we were to pick one, 70 weeks prophecy is the strongest proof that the Bible is a supernatural book. The rabbis put a curse on anybody trying to interpret that prophecy because they knew that it testified to Jesus' arrival. There's only one candidate who fulfilled that prophecy. Of course, that's Jesus. But that prophecy, exactly by the pinpoint, exact year, announces when Jesus would arrive, which would be 27 AD. And that's exactly what happened because Luke says that Jesus was about 30, and we know from other places and reasons that he was born 3 BC, September 11th, approximately. And that means he would have been about 30 in 27 AD. So if you want to know more about that, then watch my Daniel's 70 Weeks video in the End Time series. There's a 3.5-hour video there on why all these timestamps work. But nevertheless, the prophecy itself uses a very important reckoning system. It uses the reckoning system of day to year, meaning the 70 weeks is not 70 literal weeks. It's 70 weeks that are representative of years, which totals 490 years. So not 490 days, right? 70 times 7, it's 490 years, which is very, very, very important. Now, my suggestion to you is to study Daniel and to understand Daniel before you do anything else in the New Testament, whether that's Matthew 24 or Revelation or 2 Thessalonians or anything else. You need to understand Daniel. First off, because that came first. Makes sense? That's the first layer. And Daniel is a historically fulfilled book because Daniel 9, which is where the 70 weeks prophecy is connected to Daniel 8. And Daniel 9, that prophecy is a chunk that comes out of the previous given prophecy by Gabriel, which is 2,300 days. And then you realize that you can't take 490 years out of 2,300 literal days. You can take 490 years out of 2,300 years, which means that the 2,300 year prophecy in Daniel 8 is actually, the 2,300 day prophecy is actually years. It's actually years. Therefore, every other prophecy in Daniel is years, because the themes within the 1260 period and the 1335 and everything else, all of those have very similar themes with each other that the 2,300 day prophecy has. Do you get it? the themes are the same, meaning everything in Daniel is historically fulfilled. And of course, that's true because we see sequences of empires in Daniel 2 with the statue, in Daniel 7 with the various empires, and so on and so forth. So we're dealing with wide swaths of time. Very wide swaths of time, empires, powers being risen, being judged, centuries and centuries of time, etc., etc. So Daniel is a historically fulfilled book, which means that Revelation is historically fulfilled, which means that 2 Thessalonians, when it invokes the man of lawlessness, which is the little horn, is a historically fulfilled prophecy, which means also that Matthew 24 is historically interpreted. However, Matthew 24 has both relevant to the audience, immediate audience of Jesus, which is very obvious, and relevant to the church age audience throughout time. And this is a thing that people don't get because they don't like nuance. They go for the low-hanging fruit, they go for the obvious, they go for the literal, and they go either left or right. They don't see the nuance that there's something more profound going on. So, because Daniel was written before Matthew 24, and Jesus cites Daniel, we have to understand this book. And unfortunately, most people today study things in pieces. They go like, oh, there's this verse in Revelation, and they jump around, it matches this one in Daniel, rather than saying, okay, let me just read Daniel and see how does he layer these prophecies. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Daniel 9, Daniel 11, etc., etc., etc. Well, how does that compare to Revelation? Okay, let's look at Revelation 2 and 3 with the 7 churches prophecy, then the seals and the trumpets, and then the beast and the 2 witnesses and so on. So there's a whole layered cake that's going on, layer by layer by layer, which with each layer testifying as a witness to the other layers. It's really, truly profound how it's encoded. Now, I've made an End Times Prophetic Timeline, which I will link in this video, a very useful visual aid that you can see the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation laid out like a prophecy cake. And you can see how all of this comes together in a very brilliant visual way. It's truly profound when you put it all in a visual orientation. So, nevertheless, this is how these things work. They're layers. And what that means is you have layers throughout time with multiple fulfillments. Unfortunately, Preterism and Futurism are far too limited in their hermeneutic and their understanding to make sense of the entire chapter. They don't. And once you study context and you have all of these contexts, you realize why they fail over and over again. Matthew 24 has both near and far layers. In other words, it is relevant to the people surrounding Jesus and also the people who are not there, who are not yet born throughout the church age. However, there are things that could not possibly have been fulfilled in the 40-year time between that sermon and 70 AD judgment. There's no way that some of the things that Jesus spoke of were completely fulfilled. So that's a real problem for preterism and Satan's little season and anything else that it subscribes to that interpretation. The problem is that people miss the context. They miss the context. And they miss specifically the context that is set up right at the beginning. Such an important context that's set up right at the beginning. We'll go through it today. By way of the question that the apostles ask him. I want you to really understand the beginning of this chapter. Because if you do, you understand why preterism and futurism both fail. Because the context that the disciples set up is everything. And of course, Jesus decreed that they would set it up that way so that he could give the presentation in a multi-layered format. But it's very, very important because it's a two-layered question. And therefore, Jesus gives a two-layered answer. It's not a one-layered question. It's a two-layered question. So, you have to learn why preterism and futurism and Satan's little season and dispensationalism and everything else, even Seventh-day Adventist historicism is wrong. Seventh-day Adventists have many things wrong, even though they're historicists, because of Ellen White. I talk about that in my SDA series. But you have to learn why all these things are wrong and why there's a narrow road way to walk with these Bible prophecies. And that narrow road is amillennial historicism. And again, if you want a great resource, check out that video, check out the End Times series, check out the timeline, ask Fennec various questions. He can help you out with lots of these things and give you direct links to videos where you can watch them with timestamps and so on and so forth. So use the resources available to you. There's no excuse now. There literally is no excuse. You have so many resources at your fingertips, some of them free, some of them a few bucks. The prophetic timeline poster, if you just get the regular poster, I think it's like, I don't know, 15, 20 bucks or something like that. It's not expensive. So use the resources and learn these truths, because there's a lot of deception out there. Now, with that said, let's jump into the verse-by-verse walkthrough. And the first thing I want to take us to is the setup. The setup is Matthew 24, 1 through 3. Jesus foretells the destruction of the temple. Jesus left the temple and was going away, and when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. So they came out to say, look at these buildings, what do you think of them? But he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Now imagine, first off, before we go to the verse 3, imagine their reaction. Okay, you got to put yourself in their shoes. What's going on? They're walking around the temple. There's this age, right? There's the temple. There's the Roman Empire. What's going on with Israel? Are we going to get the empire back? Are we going to be like Solomon again? Look at these temples. And then Jesus says, yeah, guess what? This is all going to be destroyed. You're like, what? That's the situation. Verse 3, signs of the end of the age. As he sat on the Mountain of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be? Now don't miss this. Please don't miss this. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, do you see the issue with this question? Do you see the issue with this question? If you understand what's going on here, and again, God decreed this so that it would happen this way, so that he could reveal something very important and speak in multiple layers simultaneously. But the setup sets it up for a problem. Jesus is going to resolve this problem, but it sets it up for a problem. So Jesus, what is the context going up to Matthew 24? Let's review really quickly. In Matthew 21 is the triumphal entry. He enters Jerusalem. Then from there, there's a series of rebukes and judgments on the Jews. There's cursing the fig tree. His authority is challenged. Then he gives the parable of the two sons in the vineyard, where basically the Gentiles who rebelled against God, they're going to repent and be saved. And the Israelites who said that they would obey, they would basically be judged because they didn't obey. There's the parable of the tenants, where the kingdom is going to be taken away from them. The parable of the wedding feast, again, about the gospel, the Jews being judged for their rejection. Then they try to trap him into the taxes with Caesar situation. And then they try to trap him again with the resurrection situation with the Sadducees. Then he traps them with the whose son is the Christ challenge, with basically David saying, my Lord says to my Lord, and how can he call him Lord if he's just his son? Basically challenging him, like, do you not realize that the scriptures say the Messiah is something greater? So he's challenging their blindness. Then there's the 7 woes to the scribes and Pharisees, where he's rebuking this hypocritical religious system. And now we're at Matthew 24, right? So there's a lot going on in Jerusalem. And now we're around the temple. They're walking around. They're asking him these things. Jesus says this is all going to be destroyed. And this is a really, really big deal. Now the apostles, because they're Jews and they're wondering, okay, the Messiah's here. If Jesus is the Messiah, then the end of the age is very close. And eternity, the resurrection is going to happen. Like, all these things are going to happen very soon in their mind, okay? That's the context. And of course, the natural question would be, well, if the temple's going to be destroyed, that means God is going to usher in the final judgment, the resurrection. All these things are going to happen. So when is this going to happen? How much time do we have left? That is their position. Now, it's very important to understand from their perspective, okay, in their mind, this was one issue, okay? Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? All of that in their Jewish mind in the first century, all of that was lumped into one event. Okay? They didn't realize these are actually multiple events. These are 2 events at least, because there's the judgment in 70 AD, and then there's the second coming, which is much later. They didn't realize that. For them, all of this was happening right now. The Messiah's here. He's going to judge the nations. There's going to be a resurrection. All of this is going to happen right now, very, very soon. So when they heard that the temple's going to be destroyed, they posed a question that for them involved one event. not knowing that in fact there are two. And of course, there's other things that are happening in between those two. So there's multiple things happening, right? They didn't know that. And God allowed them to do that. He decreed that they would do that so that then Jesus could respond and address both audiences, the near audience and the far church age audience. Very, very important. They had no idea. They had no idea. So their question in their mind was one question, one issue. The signs of these judgments and the end of the age, all these things are very close together in their mind. But the reality is that they are not close together. Jerusalem was judged 70 AD, and now it's been almost 2,000 years, and Jesus has not yet returned, obviously. So this is an inherent problem with their question. If they knew that there would be 2,000 plus years, whatever, between their time and the second coming, they probably wouldn't have asked that question in that way. Do you get it? Because they're not going to be around for, the return of Jesus. I mean, they're going to be resurrected, but they're not going to be around. They're not like going to be around when the final bowl judgments drop and everything else, right? But in their mind, that's what the reality was. So this is the fundamental context of what's going on here. So very, very interesting. God intended them to equivocate, to make a mistake in the sense of asking something. They're asking multiple issues in one question. Do you get it? But they don't realize that. And God decreed that so that he could then knock it out of the park and give something very, very profound as usual. It's a lot like, for example, it's a lot like many situations, really. If you look at how Jesus interacts, he lets them set it up and then he knocks it out of the park all the time. Just like he decreed the Pharisees to come to him and to test him with a very clever question about paying taxes to Caesar, so that he could give an even more clever response and humiliate them and give something so profound that works on multiple levels. Or the situation with the resurrection. All of these things were decreed by God so that God could reveal his wisdom. So God decreed that the apostles would ask him a convoluted question that involves multiple answers so that he could give a multi-layered answer. Does that make sense? If you understand that, then the rest of this study, the rest of these verses will make much more sense because there are near and far fulfillments. So there's two different things at the very minimum. There's the judgment, and then there's the actual coming of Jesus Christ, the return. These two things are two separate events that are being addressed in this entire chapter. So that's very, very important setup. Now, verse 4. Let's see what it says. And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray." Now, another piece of important context. Before everything is ever stated, the framing that Jesus puts around it is, see to it that nobody deceives you, that you're not deceived. The entire framing is, be wary of deception. This is consistent with Revelation. Why? Because Satan is thrown down to earth and is working his master plan, which involves great deception and a counterfeit church, a counterfeit plan of salvation, massive deception, especially at the end, a lot of deception. It's consistent with 2 Thessalonians because the man of lawlessness, which is the little horn power, has to be revealed. Why? Not because it's in the far future, but because it's a deceptive power in history. People aren't going to figure it out right away. History has to testify against this power, and eventually after its bloodthirst shows and its arrogance and pride and blasphemy shows, you look in history and say, oh, there it is. It's revealed. So it has to be revealed. Why? Because it's a deceptive power. The papacy is a very deceptive power. And it's also consistent with Daniel. Why? Because the little horn destroys by way of peace, by way of cunning. He doesn't have an army of his own. He's completely different than all of the empires beforehand that were armies and empires and they had force. The little horn destroys by peace and flatteries and cunning and planning and all sorts of things. So it's a very different kind of power. Is that consistent? Is verse 4 in chapter 24 consistent with the other main eschatological texts that warn of deception as the way that the devil wages war, right? That's the Mossad's trademark. By deception we shall wage war. So yes, the devil wages war by way of deception, whether it's the Mossad, the CIA, the Vatican, the Templars, the Knights of Malta, whatever, the Jesuits. Deception is the name of the game. So see to it that nobody deceives you. That means that we're dealing with something very grandiose. It doesn't make sense to say this. See to it that nobody deceives you. If that deception that Jesus is warning about is just these tiny local handful of people in the Middle East for a period of 40 years. That's not at all, doesn't at all make sense. But when we put it over the backdrop of these other eschatological texts, it makes perfect sense why Jesus would open and frame the rest of what he's about to say with, see to it that nobody deceives you. Why? Because there's going to be a lot of deception in the church age. So we're talking big picture thing. After Matthew 24, you have other important contexts, like Matthew 25, he talks about the parables of the wise and foolish virgins, the parable of the tenants, who's going to use their resources and gifts during this time. There's the final judgment, right? All of these things, so before and after, tell you that there's more to the story than just the 40 years between the crucifixion and the judgment on Jerusalem. We're dealing with historical issues and grandiose things. Very, very important. Now, if everything he is about to say is just intended for the generation in front of him, i.e. the 40 years between the cross and the judgment, why would he say, do not be deceived? See to it that nobody deceives you. That would discount most of human history and most of Satan's activities in time after Satan is thrown down to earth. So the same is with Futurism. Right? So Preterism limits everything to that tiny little 40-year space. Meaning Jesus' words, see to it that nobody deceives you, expire after 70 AD. No longer valid, no longer important. And if you want to say that they're important, on what basis can you as a preterist? If you're saying that all of this has to do just with the people and his generation, whatever deception may have happened between then and the 70 AD judgment. After that, well, don't worry, it's not going to be as bad anymore. When in fact, Satan's deceptions have only increased over time. Same thing with Futurism and dispensationalism, which pushes everything to the far future and again ignores mostly like 99% of Satan's activities in the church age. And in fact, there's been so much deception throughout the last 2,000 years. So it doesn't make sense, folks. Was Satan not active for the last 2,000 years? Was he active only in the 40 years between the cross and the judgment in 70 AD? Or he's going to be active only in 7 years of a tribulation, quote unquote, at the very end of time? Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense at all. Doesn't make sense. A framing command like this, which is obviously very important and intended to zap your focus into this text and say, listen, do not be deceived. See to it that nobody deceives you. It's a powerful phrase. It makes the most sense if what he is about to say is very grandiose in scope, and it is inclusive of a very long period of time of satanic activity until his return, meaning the entire period of time of history until the end of history. That's what makes sense. That's what makes sense. See to it that nobody deceives you, because there's going to be lots and lots and lots of deception every single generation. That's what makes the most sense. And what proceeds after this statement confirms that this is about history. Because you see point upon point of various schemes that the devil is going to use throughout the church age. So let's see, verse 5 through 8, warnings of the age. Verse 5, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Now there have been more false Christs in the last 150 years or so than in the last 2,000 years. This is a list of Messiah claimants, and you can just read through it. In the first century, you had a Jewish Dositheus, Shlomo Molcho in the 1500s, Sabbatai Zevi, very popular one, Shukur Kail and Judah ben Shalom, 1860s, Menachem Schneerson, of course he's still idolized today by the Shabbat people. And then there's Christian Messiah claimants. A lot of these are from like the 1700s onwards. Anne Lee, John Nichols Thome, Abd Rushin, he's founder of the Holy Grail movement, Lou de Palingboer, Dutch Charismatic, An Sang Hong, World Mission Society Church of God. A lot of Korean false Christs. Sung Young Moon, founder of the Unification Church established in Seoul. Ann Hamilton Byrne. Cho Hee Sung, founder of the Victory Altar. He believes he's God incarnate. All of these people believe that they were either Jesus Christ incarnate or God incarnate or whatever else. These are all like false Christs. Lee Man-hee. These are all, by the way, from like 1700s and onwards. Jung Ming-seok. Claude Vorelhan, known as Rael, messenger of the Elohim. I think he's still around doing his little New Age movement since 1972. Jose Luis de Jesus, founder of the leader of Creciendo en Gracia. Inri Cristo, Apollo Quibeloy, he's scammed so many people in the Philippines. Brian David Mitchell, Ante Pavlovich, Sergei Torop, Alan John Miller, Divine Truth, a new religious boost movement in Australia. Oh, that's the AJ guy with his wife. They think they're like reincarnations of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Yang Xingbin, born in 1973. Muslim Messiah claimants, so many. Baha'i Messiah claimants, how many Zoroastrian Messiah claimants? All of these people especially came in the last, many of them came in the last 200 years. They're throughout time, but a lot of them came in the last 200 years. So it has only increased. It has only increased. This is not including all of the popes that have been worshipped as the presence of Christ on earth, and the vicar of Christ, the one who holds the place of Christ, basically being another God on earth. And certainly that's well documented in my Dominum Deum Nostrum Papam series. Our Lord God the Pope, that's what that means in Latin. This is a list of earthquakes. You can look it up, and a lot of the really, really big ones. There's a lot of them throughout time, but there's some major ones that have happened in the last 100, 200 years. A lot of big earthquakes with lots of people dying and more people dying because there's more people on the earth. Do you get it? So lots of earthquakes have happened, especially since that time. Much more crazy earthquakes than in the 40 years between 31 AD and 70 AD. Much more. So those words apply to the church age. As far as wars, of course, there's been more wars in the last 100 years, 150 years than, I should say, more people have died because of wars and rumors of wars and whatever else in the last 100, 150 years than ever in history. Just World War II and World War I combined together are more people than have died in all wars in all of time ever combined. So that's, outside of that 40-year block also. Now, these are obvious historical fulfillments, and the question is, are these not at all in God's warnings? Are these not at all in view in what God is warning about? In other words, when God is saying there's wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes, false Christs, is he just talking about 40 years between 31 AD and 70 AD? Could that possibly be the fulfillment? Are you really going to limit those words when there's so much obvious historical fulfillment for these things throughout time? And if anything, it shows you that they are increasing. They are increasing. In fact, I think in June of 2026, this year, supposedly there's going to be a very massive earthquake because there's a giant volcano that's about to erupt on the seafloor. Supposedly the mouth of it is like a mile wide or some crazy thing. So we'll see how that goes. But if anything, that'll be very clear fulfillment of these things. It's just increasing and increasing more and more and more. So futurism is insufficient as an explanation because it's too limited. It's just too limited. There's no way to chunk all of this stuff into 40-year periods when there is such an obviously increasing and significant fulfillment of them throughout time. And again, it doesn't make sense if he's telling you don't be deceived for 40 years. No, don't be deceived throughout this time. Why? Because Satan's going to throw false Christ. He's going to do all kinds of schemes. There's going to be, all sorts of events, of course, that Satan will use to his advantage to fool people, to get them. Like, for example, I don't remember when, I think it was 2021, 22. I think it was the last Pope Francis. But anyway, there's some major earthquake somewhere in like Turkey. And as soon as that happened, the Pope was there immediately saying, oh, let's dedicate ourselves to the Virgin Mary and pray. And any chance he gets, he uses that as an opportunity for deception. So yes, there'll be a lot of these things, and the devil's going to take advantage of them and use them for his shenanigans, for his New World Order scheme. So futurism and dispensationalism and preterism are all equally terrible. We have to believe for dispensationalism that all of this is going to happen at the very end, and there's going to be more wars, more rumors of wars, more false Christs, more earthquakes than ever at any point in time in history, which is, of course, impossible. That's nonsense. These things happen throughout time. This is irrational. Both of them are actually irrational. It is irrational to believe that Jesus is warning about all of these things in just a 40-year period of time. It is irrational to believe that Jesus is warning about some 7-year period of time in the future. Both of them are equally irrational. What actually makes sense is that these things are happening throughout time, and history proves it. History proves it very clearly. The only answer is the historical hermeneutic, because it's relevant to all times and periods. Again, you have the end of the age and the judgment on Jerusalem as two events that were asked in one question. So Jesus is going to give both answers, and he's going to weave them very expertly. But you have to discern when he's talking about things that are relevant to his generation and when he's answering the question of what are the signs of the end of the age and you're coming. That's a lot of information. That's a lot of information. So this is a very multi-layered situation. When he says birth pains, those are the beginning. That's the beginning of a long and arduous process that gets increasingly more challenging, just like birth, right? Some people have easy births, but in general, birth pains, the beginning of birth pains is a beginning of a long and arduous process. So once you start seeing earthquakes and false Christs and wars and rumors of wars, this is the end of the age, folks. We've been in the end of the age since the cross. And of course, we're coming to the end of the age, and there's very good reason to believe that. You can watch my various videos, but especially in the last 100 years, more than ever, we see very many key historic fulfillments of all of these warnings. Never mind all of the other warnings in the prophecies, like the healing of the wound, various important political shifts, the collapse of Zionism, the collapse of dispensationalism, the rise of religious nationalism. People are converting to Catholicism in mass, an American pope, the false prophet, the United States, deceiving the world into a false system, a false government. You'll see all of these things more and more rapidly come together. So we are at the end of the age. Now, verse 9 through 14, more warnings. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world. It's an important keywords, as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Again, these things are relevant to both the church age and the 40 years time until 70 AD. The persecution bit especially is relevant to both, because believers have always been persecuted and put to death. Betrayal, apostasy, false prophets, love of people growing cold. This has happened throughout time, and especially, just as before, especially in the last 100 and or so years, you see a lot more betrayals, apostasy, false prophets. Are you kidding me? With the NAR and the charismatic and Pentecostal crowd and the Jesus revolutions and all of these things happening more and more and more. Never mind all the false Christs. So many false prophets in the last 100, 150 years. Crazy amount. And of course, today with social media, the love of many grows cold. You see things happening in Gaza or things happening on the streets of other places or the United States. People being mistreated. Now, whatever your political position is, there's a fundamental level of human compassion that has become absent. Why? Because of the internet. It's easy to look at a screen. We're all so desensitized. This is by design. Do you get it? This is another indication that Jesus is warning about the church age and Satan's schemes. Because one of Satan's schemes is to nullify the conscience. And social media has been a great tool to do that. By oversaturating you with violence and, insensitive situations, your conscience just gets dull. And you look at that and say, oh, whatever, okay, that's really sad. And then you move on to the next thing on your phone. And that's by design, so that those things can happen and people just don't care anymore. So these things are in fulfillment of what Jesus warned about. Because people in, 30 AD, 40 AD, whatever, they didn't have cell phones. They were right there, front and center with everything. But when you have a phone and you're looking at things, it's easy for your heart to grow cold. So even more relevant for us. There's a call for endurance, and the endurance is consistent with other places like Revelation 13:10. If anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword must he be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. Revelation 14:12 says the same thing. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. So who is enduring? What does endurance look like? It's people who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. Notice the and. Notice the and. I've said this many times. I'm not going to expound upon it here, but I'll just mention it briefly. And is the key word of the day, because the mark of the beast is or. It's an or situation, on the head or the hand. You can either believe in this thing, or you can just, fall in line. As long as you do it. You may not believe in it all the way, but as long as you do it, doesn't matter to the devil. It's an or situation. God wants and he wants to see behavior, keeping the commandments, and their faith in Jesus. That doesn't mean you are justified by works and faith. That doesn't mean that you are saved by works. It means that true believers who have the faith in Jesus, true faith is a living faith. Okay, in Hebrew, the word for faith, which relates to amen, emunah, is a word that involves an understanding of action. It's not like a cognitive experience. Like, oh, I believe this. Believing means you actually do it. So it's a much more nuanced word. So John, who was a Jew, when he wrote faith in Jesus, for him that meant keeping the commandments. That doesn't mean you are saved by keeping the commandments. It means that if you have true, genuine faith, it manifests as a new life and with fruit of your faith that you can measure. Doesn't mean you're perfect. Doesn't mean you're saved by your works, but it means that faith is a living thing. So people who have true faith will endure because they have a different life. But nevertheless, it's an and situation. And you believe and you show it through your actions. The devil says, well, you believe or you show it through your actions. Either way. You understand? Very important. But nevertheless, that's consistent with Revelation. So Revelation is a historically fulfilled book, and it warns of endurance. It warns of persecutions throughout time. Therefore, Matthew 24, when he talks about endurance and persecutions, this is again, another point of historically fulfilled situations, not just relevant to the 40 years in between 31 AD and 70 AD. Another line is the gospel being preached to all nations. Now, that's a very important time marker because this definitely did not happen by 70 AD. The gospel had to go out into the whole world by that point. It was barely starting. So that is a very clear indicator that this is not limited to the period of time between 31 AD and 70 AD. And then the end will come. Of course, we're talking about the end of the age, the end of the world, the end of history. Not some symbolic age of the covenant or whatever else preterists believe. The end of the age, the actual end, where Jesus returns, he separates the sheep and the goats. The resurrection happens for the wicked and the righteous at the same time. The wicked are thrown into the lake of fire, etc., etc. And then the earth is renewed and so on. That's the end of the age that we're talking about here. So we're looking at a very big picture situation. It doesn't make sense for Jesus to say, for example, if we go back to let's see here. If we go back to, verse 9, then they'll deliver up to tribulation, then many will fall away and betray. There's false prophets. People's hearts are going to grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Okay? All of this, if this is just relevant for the 40 years between 31 AD and 70 AD, and then this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So now we're skipping all of human history and then going straight to, that doesn't make any sense, folks. What makes sense, if you're consistent, is that all of these things, false prophets, betrayal, lawlessness, enduring to the end, gospel being proclaimed, this is an ongoing process with a definite ending period. In that ending period, one of the measurements is that the gospel is going to go into the entire world, so everybody has basically a testimony against them. Whether they believe it or not is up to God, but there's a testimony. And then the end will come. What end? The end of the age, which is what they asked about. Do you get it? Because they asked a multi-layered question. So, now, verse 15 through 20 is the abomination of desolation, and this is where Daniel is woven in. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. Very important point. And I think that was it for this chunk. So this is where Jesus obviously brings in Daniel into the picture, which is very, very important because Daniel is a historically fulfilled book. Daniel himself believed in historically fulfilled prophecy. When he is checking the scriptures to see if the 70 years period is expired and he realizes that period is done, and he asks God for advice on what to do next, what's going to happen with Israel, what's going to happen, etc., he perceives that the time for the 70-year captivity has come to an end. That means he's looking at prophecy from a historical lens. He doesn't see 70 as like a Gnostic 7 times 10 symbolic number of some, arbitrary reality. He's seeing it as 70 years, as a historical period that needed to expire. Very, very important. When Jesus brings the abomination of desolation into his, sermon on eschatology, and he says, pay attention for this thing that's going to happen in the future. He is grounding Daniel in a historically fulfilled situation that is about to happen. The abomination of desolation is not just this symbolic thing. It is a historically fulfilled reality that will happen. So Jesus believes in historically fulfilled prophecy, and so does Daniel. So the abomination of desolation is not just some symbolic, over-spiritualized thing. It is something grounded in actual history. But, very, very big but, God is an infinite being, and he speaks in multiple layers simultaneously, so we have to learn to think differently when we are reading scriptures like these, especially ones that are dealing with history and the events that are coming to pass, because there's always multiple layers. God uses physical situations to create typological situations throughout time. Very, very important. I have a whole series on the end times, and in that you have the abomination of desolation video, which we talk about that quite a bit. Does it have a relationship to Rome judging Jerusalem? Absolutely it does. Absolutely it does. That's a real event that happened in time, and it has a very important relationship. Otherwise, it would make no sense why Jesus is addressing the people around him in Jerusalem and telling them about the abomination of desolation. So this is a command to flee for the hills when you see something happening in real time, which means that this is grounded in what is about to happen. It doesn't make sense he would be warning Jews 2,000 years in the future. It doesn't make any sense. So dispensationalism completely fails. It is true that he is warning people about something that's going to happen in Jerusalem very shortly, within this generation. It's relevant, and it's a real event that is going to happen, and they need to be warned. But, very big but, it doesn't end there. This real event, just like every other real event in history that God uses to paint multiple pictures simultaneously, this real event is a seed, it's a historical seed that bears typological fruit on multiple layers. It has many fulfillments. There's a near fulfillment, which is the physical reality, and there are far fulfillments, which are typological and spiritual. Example, just like Esau trading his birthright for a meal, which is a type for the mark of the beast, or how Nebuchadnezzar was enforcing worship to his statue, and the people who believed and said, no, we're not going to do that, they were saved from the fire. That's a type for the mark of the beast, for being saved, by Jesus, and so on and so forth. Darius, after him, of Persia, legislating against Daniel's prayer and worship. That is a type for the mark of the beast. Those are real things that happened, that God was using as a historical seed to lay a type of what's going to happen at the end. The mark of the beast is not just something that suddenly shows up at the end of time, folks. See my video, Shadows of Antichrist, the mark of the beast through time. The mark of the beast is not something that just suddenly shows up. The devil has always had his mark. The devil has always marked his own, his believers. the people who are part of his mystery religion and participate in his system. They've always had a mark of obedience, just like God's people have always had a mark of obedience. Why? Because God's people is an and situation. You must believe and show your belief through new actions. That's the mark of a believer. And of course, one of those actions is keeping the Sabbath. Very important. If that sounds legalistic to you, it's not. It's not legalistic at all. So watch my Sabbath series, watch my Lord's Day series, so you understand the nuance on this issue, because that will be one of the ways that Satan enforces obedience, is through a Sunday sacredness system that's going to demand that you do religion and faith and worship in God a certain way. And if you don't bow down to this system, then you're going to receive economic penalties. Nevertheless, there's shadows of that throughout time, because the devil has always enforced obedience. So the mark of the beast is not just something that pops up at the end of the time. The devil finally figures out, you know what, maybe I should enforce obedience. No, he's always enforced obedience. And you can see that through history, through various real situations that have near fulfillments and far fulfillments. Of course, we're warned by the mark of the beast, because that's going to be the final test, because the devil will finally have the means to control everybody's economic decisions. And that won't last very long, thank God, but nevertheless, you can see these throughout time. So there are typological threads throughout time that speak on multiple levels. When you look at Scripture, whether it's typology of Christ, typology of the mark of the beast, etc., there's always typological things, because God is an infinite being. He does things on a million layers simultaneously. Okay, we don't think like that. We think very like linear. And if you think linear, you're not going to get it. You're going to be deceived by either preterism or dispensationalism. So you have to think multidimensionally as much as you possibly can and see typologically that there are near fulfillments, far fulfillments. Something can have multiple meanings simultaneously. And this is what you're dealing with here. You have a real physical situation that happened with the Romans that is a seed of spiritual oppression and eventually a final choice that God's people will have to make when this system takes full and absolute control. But it has done this throughout time, whether it was the Roman Empire or the Papal Empire after that, or various secular societies, or even recently, you see the same thing. 2020, the liberal empire of the United States enforced obedience to its mask mandates and everything else. And if you didn't, there were economic consequences. More recently with MAGA and Trump, what do? They're enforcing obedience to the anti-Semitism laws, and they're cutting funding for people, putting people in jail who are supporting Palestine. These are just waves, little waves where the devil is showing his teeth, and a little taste of what's to come. Now, verse 20 says that beware that your flight isn't on a Sabbath. There's a warning about the Sabbath. And now, guess what? Well, he's not talking to rebellious Jews that are going to reject him, and they're going to be just like legalistic Jews who are going to be judged. He's not warning those, because those people don't care about his warnings. He's warning believers. He's warning believers that will be in Jerusalem at that time, and he's giving a very specific warning about the Sabbath. Now, history tells us that Jerusalem was judged on a Sabbath, like many other big judgments, like the flood, like Jericho, like the first temple, like Passover, like many judgments that were on a Sabbath, because the Sabbath represents safety for God's people and judgment for the rest. Because if you are entering God's rest, there's no judgment for you. There's no condemnation for the elect. So the Sabbath is a physical picture of that dividing line between people who are entered into God's rest and who are saved, and people who are outside of God's rest and who are judged. So he's not talking to rebellious Jews. He's talking to Jewish Christians that are going to be in the future. Now, why would he warn them about the Sabbath? Because the Christians of that time kept the Sabbath. That's why. Very, very important. And that's something that I encourage you to learn about with my Lord's Day series, my Sabbath series, and anything else. Probably the end time series has some stuff in there too. Now, let's proceed, because we still have a few verses in this. Verse 21 through 22. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. Now, very quick point. What did we just talk about? We talked about the abomination of desolation, which is grounded in history. Something's going to happen very soon. And you need to be aware of that so you can flee for the mountains. Make sure you're not on the Sabbath, because that's when it's going to happen. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Verse 21, immediately after that, it says, for then there will be great tribulation, meaning after this situation, there will be great tribulation, such as not has been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Now, the abomination of desolation, which is a real event, i.e. the Roman legions under Titus desecrating the temple and destroying the building, not leaving one stone over another and so on and so forth, that begins a tribulation period that is very great. Now, who is the tribulation for? Is it for the wicked? No, it's for God's people. God's people need to be warned that there's going to be lots of tribulation, and he who endures to the end will be saved, right? So there's tribulation for God's people. The wicked, they're meaningless. They're just temporary villains to the story that are going to be destroyed. Now, some read this as the tribulation being the horrible judgment done to the Jews by the Romans, where lots of people were crucified, Jerusalem was burned, the temple was destroyed, so on and so forth. However, despite how horrible that was, it was very horrible, it doesn't have the absolute significance that Jesus is impressing upon you with what he's saying. Because he says, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, and no one ever will be again." Why? Well, because after this tribulation period is done, it's over. Jesus is returning, and you're going to have eternity. You're going to have tribulation never again. Right? He wipes the tear from your eyes. So there's a lot more grandiose aspect to this, especially if we're consistent with everything else we have read, because now we're switching gears. Do you get it? We're switching gears. We talked about the abomination of desolation, something that's coming up, very important to his audience, immediate audience. For then, after that, then there's going to be a great tribulation period, going back to the things that we were talking about with false Christs, love of many growing cold, false prophets, etc., throughout the church age, earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars. All of that is this tribulation period. It's not some 7-year period in the future, and it's certainly not just what happened to the Jews in 70 AD, because there's a lot of horrible things that have happened. I mean, it doesn't even come close, man. When you talk about how many millions of people died with communism, the Holodomor, Pol Pot, what's his name, Mao Zedong or whatever, killing millions and millions and millions of people. Whether they were Christians or not, doesn't matter. They were killed brutally, tortured, starved to death. I mean, those things were horrible. They didn't even come close to how many. The Jews being crucified and stuff was horrible in Jerusalem, but it doesn't come close to how many people were brutally murdered and tortured and starved to death in just the last 150 years alone, with all of the shenanigans of the devil. So again, both preterism and futurism make no sense. They don't make any sense. They don't make any sense that at the last 7 years of history, there's going to be some tribulation. It's going to be worse than World War II, World War I, worse than communism combined. Oh, it's just going to be worse. Billions are going to die. That's not going to happen, folks. It just doesn't make sense. And the limited view of preterism in the 40-year period, that also doesn't make any damn sense. It really doesn't. So you have to be honest and consistent and realize that now Jesus is shifting the camera view. He gave the people around him very specific warnings, and now he's, zooming out a little bit. Now, what else was I going to say? Yeah, I was going to say futurism sees a very intense period, and preterism sees a very intense period in the past. They both see really intense, tiny little periods for a very limited amount of people in the future of the past, which is, of course, nonsense. The only logical explanation is that once this judgment happens that he just warned about, the abomination of desolation, once this thing happens, once the historical thing comes to pass, then there begins a period of tribulation for the saints that will be very arduous. It will be filled with what he just said: false Christs, love of many growing cold, apostasy, false prophets, wars and rumors of wars, famines, earthquakes. That tribulation period is going to start with the judgment in 70 AD. And in fact, that's consistent with Revelation, because Revelation talks about the judgments, the various judgments, the trumpet judgments. I hold the view that the first trumpet is Jerusalem. Some people who are historicists generally hold to the first 4 trumpets being Rome. I don't really think that's the case. I think there's a very good logical case we can make that the first trumpet is Jerusalem, and then the trumpets 2 through 4 are Rome. Certainly that. But the first trumpet is Jerusalem, and because that was a major judgment, and that is the thing that kicks off the tribulation. Do you get it? That is the thing, according to Jesus, that seems to kick off this tribulation period of the church age, where there's a lot of things going on. So, Satan is thrown down to earth during this period. There's wars, there's death that is decreed, there's deception, there's evil. In Revelation, John says he is already in the tribulation, and this was written after 70 AD. Revelation 1 verse 9 says, I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. So he is in the tribulation. He's acknowledging this truth to his fellow brothers and sisters that, hey, we're in the tribulation period now. Now, a lot of people who are preterist want to argue that Revelation was written before 70 AD. Yet, now notice there's a lot of reasons why it wasn't, folks. It wasn't. I talk about that in my refuting preterism video in the End Time series. There's a lot of reason why it was not written before 70 AD. But I'll give you one very simple one that I didn't cover in that video. And I'll show you how preterists refute themselves with their own perspective on Matthew 24. So, preterists say the Revelation was written before 70 AD. Okay. Yet, you believe that Matthew 24 is just about the 70 AD judgment. In other words, everything that Jesus talks about in this chapter is just about the 40-year period between 31 AD and 70 AD. That's it. We don't have to worry about anything else. That's the period it's relevant to. Okay. All right. But by their own logic, they refute their position. How does that work? Well, if the abomination of desolation is the judgment in 70 AD, which it is, that's what he's warning about, and then the tribulation comes after that, John could not have written Revelation before 70 AD because for him, he was already in the tribulation. For him, it was a started deal. Now, do you think that John doesn't know what Jesus said in Matthew 24? Of course he does. He was there. So he understands that now the tribulation has started. Therefore, he didn't write Revelation before 70 AD. He wrote it after. Otherwise, it makes no sense. Why would he say, your partner in the tribulation? What tribulation? The tribulation that Jesus announced that would happen after Jerusalem got judged. But if you wrote it before Jerusalem got judged, that doesn't make any sense by your own perspective. Of course, there's a lot of reasons other than that why Revelation was written after 70 AD. So anyway, preterism, SLS, whatever else, it fails. Fails horribly. Now, verse 22 talks about the days being cut short. And I believe it has dual application. People were saved from the Jerusalem judgment. Obviously, not everyone was killed because Jesus gave warnings ahead of time. He gave a warning so people could be saved. However, this has an application for the end, or in the sense of, the entire church age, the period of tribulation that has been announced with wars, deception, false Christs, people's heart growing cold, etc., 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 right? That period, those days have been cut short. Otherwise, nobody would be left alive. Why? Well, I'll tell you very simply that with 200 kilometer per hour drones, the ability to hunt you down with robot dogs, whatever else, they're going to have in 6 to 10 years from now, they're not going to waste too much time. Okay. They're going to find you whether you're hiding in the woods in a cabin or not. If it's for you to be, by the sword, you go by the sword. If it's for you to survive, then you'll survive. So, nobody wants to think about that, but that's what Revelation says. So the point is that nothing's going to get you out of this other than God's sovereignty. So if God had allowed the devil to use this final system to its maximum, it's going to be very efficient and nobody would be left alive. Everybody would be hunted down like rats very quickly. At least back in the Roman Empire, you could hide underground. There weren't things like GPS. Okay. They weren't tracking people. They could try to find you, but you could get away. People lived underground for a while. That's not really going to happen at the end. Once they have this technological system, it's going to be very easy to find people, folks. It really is. And I don't say that to scare you, but I say that because once they do start persecuting people, and you see people being thrown in jail, maybe even worse, for not bowing down to this religious system, that the time is short because the days were cut short so that some people would be left alive. Some people would be left alive. And we know that some people will be left alive from Paul. 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 17, if I can click on it. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will be always with the Lord. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be in heaven and you're just going to live in heaven forever. It just means you're going to be forever with God. Once you are reunited physically with God and elevated into the air along with the people who are resurrected, everybody's going to be elevated. You're there with God forever. There's some people who theorize that this is happening right around the time of Battle of Armageddon, maybe after, maybe before. I don't really know. It's the wedding party escorting the groom back down to the earth. That's the theme going on here. But nevertheless, the point is not that you're going to be in heaven. The point is you're now with God forever, and you're not going to be ever separated. Like physically, you're there. You're there in his presence, and you're never going to be absent. But there are people who are left alive, and the people who are left alive are going to join the people who are being resurrected, and they're going to be transformed. Everyone is going to receive a new body in the air. It's going to be a very supernatural situation, obviously. This is not a rapture. It's a supernatural levitation at the end of all of the elect. How it's going to work exactly, who knows? Who cares? I mean, do you really care at that point once you're hovering in the air? I know that I won't at that point. But the point is, this is at the very, very end. Again, probably could be before the Battle of Armageddon, maybe after. Who really knows? I don't know. I don't have a very solid interpretation of that because it's not entirely clear. But it doesn't matter. We just know that it's at the very end. Jesus returns on the 777, seventh trumpet, seventh seal, seventh bowl, and all of this stuff happens. How it happens exactly in sequence, I don't know. And I'm not going to try to know because there's really nothing that is very clear contextually to give me the order of that. But it doesn't matter because it's all going to happen very quickly. Nevertheless, this is a limiter on Satan's actions. So when you see, again, people being thrown in jail or worse or whatever for not obeying the papal Catholic teaching New World Order system, then you know that the time is very short. The time is very, very short. And at that point, if you have not repented out of this system, you have very, very little time because the bowl judgments are going to start. And once they do, and people start busting out in sores, and the waters of the earth turn to blood and whatever else, it's not going to take long, folks. It's going to take maybe a few weeks tops. That's my guess, because the plagues in Egypt took, like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, something like that, 22 days. So it's not going to take long. And I think the same is going to be with the final judgments. So they have very good technology. They can track people down very quickly. And as a result, that has been capped so that some people can be left alive. As for when all of this will happen, I don't know. Certainly, like I said, it's not going to be like the Inquisition where it took hundreds and hundreds of years of hunting people down like rats. It's going to happen over the course of probably a year or two, maybe 3. I don't know. I can't see them with that kind of technology spending years and years and years to enforce the situation. I just don't see that. It's going to happen very quickly. But as to when it's going to happen, who knows? My feeling, I've said before, after 2034, things get very murky for me. They really do. I don't see the Earth going beyond that. After 2040, even more. I just don't see the Earth continuing in its current form after 2040. I really don't. Even 2040 to me is outstandingly optimistic in terms of, I don't know if it's optimistic to be around that long, but it's outstandingly conservative. Let's put it that way. I would say 2034, maybe earlier, maybe a little bit later, but that's my period. I'm not setting dates or times. I'm just giving you, based on everything I've studied, an educated guess as to how all of this will wrap up. We could be completely wrong. But there's a lot of very significant things that have happened and that will continue to happen with anniversaries that to me just all line up for very, very interesting times. See my video, The Last Decade, and see what you think of that. So anyway, moving on, 23 through, verse 28. Continuing on with this section. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Now, very quick point. I have seen so many comments when people say, even the elect will be deceived. No, the elect are not going to be deceived. That's the whole point of being elect. So do not think that even the elect will be deceived. No, there's no elect getting deceived, folks. The point is, the signs and wonders are going to be so great and so marvelous that if it were possible, Satan could deceive the elect. In other words, this is a hyperbole statement, an idiomatic statement to tell you how much shenanigans the devil is doing. Of course, this correlates to 2 Thessalonians, the strong delusion, how the devil deceives all these people into destruction. Deception is the name of the game, continually. Verse 25, see, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east and shines as far from the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, the vultures will gather. Now, this repeats the warnings of the false prophets and false Christs, so we're dealing with historically fulfilled situations. Do you see how he went in and out? He went into the immediate situation with the abomination of desolation, then he zoomed back out and started talking about the tribulation, reiterating certain points that are going to happen. And in this case, zooming in on a particular portion of that historical time frame with false Christs and repeating another warning about false Christs, which means that we need to be watching for false Christs in the church age. This is a very important point, folks. There's no wasted word in the Bible. And when God repeats something and there's a significance to it, it means that it's more important. In other words, it's something to put your focus on. Like, for example, the 1260 period in Daniel and Revelation. The 2300-day period and the 1335 period. And what else is there? The 1335 and there's the 1390, is it? Or whatever. I forget the other one. But there's three periods total that aren't really mentioned anywhere else. Mentioned once in the book of Daniel. The 1260 period is mentioned several times. I think 6 times in Revelation. It's mentioned multiple times, which means that, hey, repeat. This is important. You need to know this 1260 period. What is it in history? And you need to know who it's pointing to. It's not just literal days, it's years. And if it's years, how to identify in history? Well, that gives you plenty of meta tags, so to speak, to identify it. Of course, that period is the period of papal imperial rule from 538 to 1798. When the Pope was arrested and the mortal wound was given, and now we are in the process of that wound being healed. But I talk about that in my End Time series quite a bit. The point is that God repeats this warning of false Christs. And when he repeats it, it means there's something extra important that we need to pay attention. Now, in the context of everything else, like Daniel and Revelation and 2 Thessalonians, the main enemy of the church age is deceptive. We've established that from all 4 texts. And if you look in history, that main enemy is a false Christ. That main enemy is the false Christ of the papacy. Also, the Eucharistic Christ, which deceives countless people into idolatry and submission to the false Christ of the papacy. They work together, the Eucharistic Christ and the false Christ of the papacy. Notice how he says, if they tell you, go to the inner rooms, he's there, the presence of Christ is there, come and see, come believe, come eat Christ. Don't do it. It's not me. I have not come down from heaven into that cracker. I promise you. I'm not there. The Catholic teaching of the Eucharist is that it holds the real presence of Christ. In other words, Jesus comes down into that cracker and you can bow down and kiss and revere this cup that has a cracker in it. And when you eat the cracker, you're eating Jesus. And by the way, Alphonsus of de Liguori, if you ever read his book, Dignities and Duties of the Priesthood, you can read some very nice, blasphemous things in there about what they believe about the power of the priest to basically invoke a god like a genie into the cracker and say, basically they're creating the creator. I don't make this up. This is not hyperbole. This is exact quoted language, creating the creator. Go look it up. Look at my Pope series. Look at my Synagogue of Satan series. You'll find it all there and you can read it for yourself. The blasphemous things that were written. And Alphonsus gosh, that name is tough. Alphonsus de Liguori was canonized as a saint. So does that mean they agree with what he wrote? Absolutely, because that's Catholic teaching. The Catholic Catechism tells you that you can worship the Eucharist. In fact, it commands you to do so. If you don't believe in transubstantiation, you don't believe in the abomination of the Eucharistic Christ, you are anathema, according to the Council of Trent. So these things are very much in line with the warnings, the repeated warnings that Jesus gives. Isn't that fascinating? How he warns of these tribulations, warns of deception, and then repeats a warning specifically about false Christs, which applies to the 2 major deceptions in the church age, which is the papacy and the Eucharistic Christ. The Eucharistic Christ is currently being used to wrap up all the denominations in one with the charismatic experiences, supernatural Eucharistic miracles, and of course all of that is in submission to the false Christ of the papacy, the vicar of Christ who claims to be the presence of God on earth alive. So, very, very interesting. Just as the corpse makes the vultures gather, so too do you need to watch the signs that Jesus has given so that you are not deceived. Now, are many people deceived today by false Christs? Have many people been deceived throughout history by the false Christ of the papacy and the false Christ of the Eucharist? Absolutely. Billions of people have been deceived and continue to be deceived. So, these are very relevant words. Much more relevant than if you limit your view to the 40 years time between 31 AD and 70 AD, and certainly much more relevant than limiting it to 70 or 7 years in the future. that dispensationalism. In fact, dispensationalism doesn't even have a fulfillment for these things, because for dispensationalism, the enemy is not a false Christ. The enemy is just people have all sorts of theories. Pin the tail on the Antichrist. Is it Trump? Is it Obama? Is it Elon Musk? There's so many different Antichrists they have, but the Bible defines it for you very clearly. But you have to use in context. Matthew 24, Daniel's various beasts, Revelation, 2 Thessalonians. You see a very comprehensive picture of this deceptive power that is an institution of men, but nevertheless, it's a power. It's a different kind of power. It's an empire of sorts that rules by peace and deception. And of course, as a mark of its obedience, has Sunday sacredness, which is attached to the Eucharistic Christ and bowing down to that dogma. So many people are deceived by these things in fulfillment of Christ's words. Verse 29 through 31, the coming of the Son of Man, immediately after the tribulation of those days. So after this period is over, this long period of false Christs, wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes, betrayals, etc., after that period, what's going to happen? The sun is going to be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now we're talking about the things at the very, very end, right? When the final bowl judgments happen. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all of the tribes of the earth will mourn, which, by the way, did not happen in 70 AD. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds from one end of heaven to another. Is this consistent with what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4, where you're going to be lifted up into the air? Yeah. Now, whether that's going to be some sort of supernatural, like you start levitating, or an angel is going to come and pick you up, I don't know. Not going to matter at that point, but something's going to happen to that effect. So when the tribulation period of the church age ends, the final signs will appear. They're going to be astronomical signs. They're going to be supernatural signs. All of these things align with the 777 timeline in Revelation, the rock that comes to destroy the statue in Daniel 2, etc., etc. Peter also describes these signs very vividly in 2 Peter 3, verse 11 through 12. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of the Lord, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. So supernatural things happening. The firmament will probably crack open. Who knows? It's going to be something like you've never experienced in your life. It's going to be unmistakable. There's not going to be a way that you're going to miss the second coming. It will be the most prolific event in human history. It'll be supernatural. It'll be great. It'll be mighty. Very, very big. This prophecy has worldwide implications. Okay? Very obvious. All the tribes of the earth will mourn. This is all of the tribes. It's not a local situation happening in Jerusalem and like a couple, like Romans and Jews are the two tribes that are mourning. Like, that doesn't make sense, folks. That's such a minuscule and minimizing interpretation. Sending the angels, loud trumpet calls, supernatural signs across the sky, the firmament cracking open, lightning across the sky, angels gathering people from one end of heaven to the other, lifting them in the air. None of these things have happened, folks. There's no historical record for these things happening. None. Preterism or Satan's little season believe these things happened already and deal with Jerusalem, but it's not true. Of course, they point to certain accounts by Josephus, where Josephus describes some supernatural things that supposedly happened and signs over Jerusalem in 70 AD. Sure, that's entirely possible. I don't deny that, but we're not fulfilling what Jesus described as the coming of the Son of Man at the end of the age. We're not fulfilling it at all. Think of this very critically. Do the things that I just read to you, do they sound like they are relevant only to 70 AD? Does lightning flashing across the entire sky, angels coming down and picking people up into the air and gathering them from one end of heaven to another, all of the tribes on earth mourning, does all of that sound like it's like just really exaggerated language, but what it really means is like, locally Judea 70 AD. Is that what it means? Or are we talking about worldwide impact? Is there any record of these things happening, of lightning across the entire sky, or of angels coming and picking people up? Is there any record of any of that? No, there's no record. But you know what? We have records of things like the flood. We have record even of the crucifixion. If I can just pull this up, here we go. Ancient Chinese depiction of the day of Christ's crucifixion. In what can only be explained as God's Spirit working throughout the world, we have ancient Chinese records of a day in 31 AD, proof that he didn't get crucified in 33 AD, but 31 AD. Why? Because he was born in 3 BC, started his ministry in 27 AD at about 30, 3.5 years later, spring of 31 AD. Where they describe the darkening of the sun for a prolonged period. This is what the Bible said occurred on the day of Christ's crucifixion. Surely enough, there is a corroborating description of this event in Chinese records. Quote, yin and yang have mistakenly switched and the sun and the moon were eclipsed. The sins of all the people were put on one man. Pardon was proclaimed to all under heaven. Chronicles of the Emperor Guangwu, 7th year. Here is the second translator who came to the same conclusion. Through the Spirit of God, the writer of this ancient Chinese document knew the reason for the darkening of the sun, just like Jesus taught Paul through the Spirit. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. God bless. So these are very interesting historical situations. And we have record of these things when the crucifixion happened. But imagine now the coming of the Son of Man with even greater signs, and yet there's no record of it. Where is the record if such a thing happened? Of course, there is no record, which means that preterism and the interpretation of these words from a preterist viewpoint is false. The return of Jesus, where the firmament is opening, people are levitating, lightning is across the sky, is the biggest event in human history. And you're going to tell me that there's no record of it. The only record we have are some local signs that Josephus marked down. But there's no people being levitated into the air. There's no resurrection. There's no lighting across the sky that was viewed in other places. If it's across the sky, then it stands to reason that somebody somewhere other than Judea would have observed such a thing. In fact, there's actually records, believe it or not, now that I think about it, of the sun standing still, which confirms, Joshua? Was it Joshua? I forget anyway, where the sun is commanded to stand still. There are records in other pagan cultures of this happening. So if there's records of the sun standing still, if there's records of the worldwide flood, if there's records even of the crucifixion and the eclipse that happened and the things that were supernaturally happening there, why are there no records of the coming of the Son of Man? Because the Son of Man has not come yet. Plain and simple conclusion. There may have been supernatural signs over Jerusalem. Absolutely. Yeah, there was a major judgment. First trumpet. That's my viewpoint. Whether you agree with that or not, it doesn't matter. It was a major judgment. So yes, probably there was some angelic host or some sort of appearance that God is showing like, listen, you really biffed it this time, Jews. And so, yeah, but that doesn't mean that fulfills the coming of the Son of Man. Very, very important. So you have to be able to see a nuanced situation. Another important point is this. Why would God rescue only a small group of people and leave the rest to suffer through all of the trials of the tribulations that were announced? False Christs, rumors of wars, plagues, whatever. I was going to say fasting, famines. Why would he rescue only a handful of people? This is preterism and dispensationalism. The more you think about it, they're all really the same version of the same lie with just different packaging. Satan's Little Season is like one giant Left Behind novel, except it's worse than dispensationalism because you're left behind for like thousands of years or hundreds of years, however, depending how long you believe Satan has been released. But it's one giant Left Behind novel. Jesus already came. You missed out on the great Tartarian golden age. Sucks for you. And well, Satan's alive and doing all these things right before he's going to be destroyed, but he's been doing it for hundreds of years. So you're kind of stuck in that generation that's been left behind. Dispensationalism, you're left behind for several years. Seventh-day Adventism, the devil's left behind and everybody's in heaven. What else? Preterism, Jesus came and did all these things in 70 AD, and everybody's just kind of, you're left behind and whatever. You're just dealing with the Genesis curse. It's all just the same stuff, folks. It's all just there to discourage you and to distract you from the truth. But these things are not true. The reality is that this is a historically fulfilled prophecy with also some relevance for the people in Jesus' time. But you can see how he goes in and out. People did not have video cameras there, okay? They didn't have, cinematography. They had words. And this is a common technique to have a change of perspective mid-sentence or a mid-thought, describing one thing and then zoom out. Let's look at something else. And that's exactly what's happening here. Now, the next verses are the lesson of the fig tree, which of course parallels the corpse parable. And it reiterates this idea that you need to watch for the signs. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and puts out its leaves, you know that the summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. This is the verse that gets everybody twisted. Hopefully we will make it easier today. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So, famous words, and they warn people essentially to be watchful for these signs, because now we're wrapping this chapter up. And just as before, you had the parable of the virgins, you have various parables to be watchful, various warnings, don't be deceived, so on and so forth. Now, verse 34 is what makes everybody get really tripped up by this entire chapter. So far, up until here, I think it makes pretty simple sense. Jesus gets asked a two-pronged question. Unbeknownst to the questioners, but known to him, there's a two-pronged answer. So he gives the big picture, then he zooms in, gives the warning for the audience in his midst, and then he zooms out and back to the big picture saying, look, once this happens, there's a whole age that's going to happen until the very end, and here's the sign of my return. So, very, very important. Of course, people were like probably scratching their heads and thinking, is all this going to happen like pretty soon? Not realizing that Jesus is intending these words to go throughout time for all peoples so that they have something to look at and understand what's going on. So, but we come to verse 34, and that seems to flip everything on its head. Because when you read this, it seems to suggest that everything he talked about is actually just having to do with the 40 years between 31 AD and 70 AD. And it trips up a lot of people. Now, before we try to understand this and dissect it, we need two important principles. Two very important principles that you cannot stray from. Principle number one is Jesus cannot contradict himself. It is impossible for God to contradict himself. God speaks only the truth, and when he speaks something, he sets a precedent. So if something later seems like it's contradictory, there's something deeper going on, whether it's a translation issue in the translation you're reading, or a contextual issue, or whatever else. But we know that God cannot contradict himself. That's number one. Number two, up until now, up until this verse 34, we have clearly seen that there are near and far fulfillments of Jesus' words. In other words, there are two perspectives being danced or balanced, held in the balance, because the question that he was asked was a two-pronged question. Make sense? Those two things are very important. Jesus can't contradict himself, and so far we have already seen that there are multiple perspectives going on in these verses. Important questions to ask yourself are, what does this generation mean? Is the word all in all these things, is that literally all, or is it idiomatic, symbolic, figurative? Third question, is there an alternative translation that could be used for this verse? Maybe there's a translation issue. Those are important questions to ask in order to harmonize what we have just read with this verse, so that it doesn't seem like there's a contradiction. If the preterist reading is true, and preterism takes all of these things at their face value, literally, and this generation is just the Jews in the past, in his immediate audience, and all in all these things is literally everything that he discussed up to that point, then we have major problems. We have contradictions. Why? Because there is no fulfillment for the coming of the Son of Man. And that is included in all of these things because it's before verse 34. There's no fulfillment for the gathering of the elect. There's no fulfillment for the gospel going out into all the nations. There's no fulfillment for any of these things. So it doesn't make sense if all of these things are literally interpreted. So whenever we see a seemingly contradictory section, again, it's always a sign that there's more to the story. Whether it's a translation issue or a contextual issue or whatever else, there has to be something. And in this case, my friends, there's actually both. There's a contextual issue going on and a translation issue going on. Now, I'm going to give you several options, and then I will comment on which one I personally lean towards. Option number 1, we take the word this generation, genea, and we look at the fact that it has a semantic range. So here's the word genea, and it has two meanings. It means like a generation, like the generation in front of you, or by implication, an age, the period of the persons, like all the generations from Abraham. So it can mean an age. The word genea it's not limited semantically to just like a single generation present in front of Jesus. It could mean an age. An age. Now, that means if that is the wider view, and we're thinking this age or series of generations, then we're dealing with something much more broad and historical. Kind of like Genesis 3:15, where the seed of the serpent, the seed of the woman, these are seeds throughout time, right? They're seeds throughout time. It's not like a specific person or just the next generation like with Cain. It's a seed of rebellious wicked throughout time that are constantly against God's people, who are, the seed of the woman, the Messiah, ultimately everybody who's grafted into the Messiah. So in this way of interpreting it, if you interpret generation, genea, in its wider semantic range, it would be this generation of wickedness, or this age of wicked people is not going to pass away until all of these things are fulfilled. So all of these things is literally everything you just talked about, and until all of them are fulfilled, that's going up to the very end of time. So the age, the generation, the series of generations, the evil reprobate that are determined, they're determined until the very end. And they're not going to go away until Jesus returns and judge them. That's one way of interpreting this. And that harmonizes with everything else. There's no conflict, because generation is not literally the generation in front of him, but rather an age or a series of generations. Option number 2. This generation refers literally to the people in Jesus' time. But these things, all these things, only relate only to the things relevant to them in terms of the abomination of desolation, the judgment, and so on. Remember that there's a two-pronged question beginning in the very beginning of verse 3. And when they tell us when these things will come to pass, and what are the signs of your coming, there are two things being outlined to you. Do you get it? They're asking, when are these things going to happen? Well, these things, which are later reiterated by Jesus, these things relate to the judgment, because they're responding to the fact that no stone will be left on top of another. So these things relate to the judgment and the signs of your coming. Those are two different things. So when Jesus says all these things, he's referring to the things related to the judgment, not everything that he talked about, including the gospel going out to the nations, people being levitated in the air, the return of Jesus, and so on and so on. He's not including those when he says these things, all these things. So they're relevant just to the people in his audience at the time when he says these things. Of course, Jesus spoke of both near and far fulfillments up to this point, but he is wrapping the statement, these things, in the things that are relevant to the people in his time, because he's speaking to them. That would be one way of interpreting. That's option 2. Option 3 is to look at the word all and realize that it's maybe not literal, but idiomatic. For example, Mark 1, verse 32 says, oh my gosh, this thing is always misbehaving. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons. Did they bring literally everybody to him? No. This is an idiomatic hyperbole that says they brought a lot of people to him. They didn't bring literally all the people who were sick in Judea or Syria or whatever else. Another verse is Matthew 4, verse 24. So his fame spread throughout all of Syria, and they brought to him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. Again, did it spread to all, like in every literal person in Syria and every literal sick person in Syria were brought to him? No. Not literally. This is an idiomatic thing explaining a very big impact, a very huge impact, obviously very big impact, very significant impact, but not literally every single person or every single, piece of land or territory. It's just an idiomatic situation because we do this all the time. We do this all the time with language. For example, that meeting lasted 1,000,000 hours. Did it last 1,000,000 hours? No, it lasted a long time. Everyone in the world heard about that rumor. Do you mean everyone in the world? Do you mean like a lot of people in your local community? So there's no difference. This is just idiomatic language. Now, if you read all these things, excuse me, as literally everything you just talked about, if you insist on that interpretation, and it's not wrong to do so, but if you read all of these things as literally everything he just talked about up until verse 34, then pay attention to this. Then you must read this generation as symbolic or figurative. You must. Because you cannot read all these things as literally everything he talked about and this generation as literally only the people in front of him. This is the problem with the literal, hyper-literal hermeneutic of preterism with this verse. Because then you have contradictions. Again, there's no fulfillment for all those important things. So it can't obviously include everything that he's talked about. It can't. There's something else going on. And that means that there's an interpretation, flexibility on these three elements. All these things, this generation, and of course the last one is the issue with until, with the time marker. If you read this generation as literally the people in his audience, which again, you can do that, but what does that mean for the rest of the sentence? Well, you must read all these things as idiomatic, meaning figurative. He's not meaning all of these things, just like all of the sick aren't all of the sick literally. He's referring, to these things in general that are going to happen. Or he's selectively talking about the near fulfillments only relevant to the judgment of Jerusalem, when he says all these things. If you insist on reading this generation as literal, you have to make a change or a compromise on, it's not really a compromise, it's a tweak, but you have to make a tweak on all these things, and you have to understand it in a different way. You have to understand it either figurative or selective or whatever else. If you read all these things literally and you want to insist that this includes everything before that, then this generation has to be figurative. So this is the dance, folks. This is the dance of life, the dance of interpretation, always between literal and figurative. If you're hyper-literal, then you're going to be deceived. That's what dispensationalism, preterism do all the time. They're hyper-literalists. If you are full-on, symbolic, figurative all the time, then you can make the Bible say whatever you want it to say. So you have to ground it in reality and history and truth and see that there's a balance between literal and symbolic. Now, there's a solution to this. And I think it's the most beautiful solution. Option 4 is a different translation of the word genitai or genitai. Let's take a look. So if you see Matthew 24:34, interlinear. Truly I say to you that not will have passed away the generation this until all these things shall have taken place. Genitai. Generated. This is where we get the word generated, right? They have been generated or taken place. Now, this is translated by most translations as a past tense reality. Shall have taken place, meaning past tense, which locks you into the dialectic that I just described. Meaning, if this is past tense and you leave it that way, then you have to have some sort of balance between literal and figurative, between this generation and all these things. If you leave this as past tense, shall have taken place, until this has taken place, and that's locked in because that locks in literally the 70 AD judgment. Now you have to flex with these things. Or you can see genitai as the end of time, and you have a symbolic generation. So it really affects how you interpret it. Do you understand? And it makes you have to balance this figurative and literal hermeneutic. However, there are other ways to interpret this. If you look at different usages of this, it has the sense of beginning also. If there should be to any man, if it should be, there's some other ones I think, that might become So there's a riot might occur. The salt becomes unsalty. So there's this sense of becoming, beginning to become, shall become, it may become. There's this sense in the Greek that it may become. For example, to cause, to be, to generate, reflexively, to become, to come into being, used with great latitude, literal, figurative, and intensive, and so on. So there's this sense, and I'll read it to you from Google, because I'm not a Greek expert, but Google did a good job of summarizing the arguments on this from various scholars. I asked if my position is amillennial historicism. Here's what I would think. How do I get around this situation? There's got to be some situation. And it says, in alignment with amillennial historicism, your reading is supported by a significant body of Greek scholarship that distinguishes between a mere 40-year window and a transgenerational age. Generation, genea, is a spiritual kind. This is what we talked about previously. Lexically, genea is not limited to contemporaries. The strongest case for your position is the qualitative or pejorative interpretation of the word. A kind of people. Scholars like F.E.N.N.E.C and Hendrickson argue that genea refers to a type of humanity, specifically the rebellious, unbelieving lineage of the offspring of the vipers, mentioned in 23 verse 33, which is a chapter, just the chapter previous. Spiritual continuity. In this view, Jesus is promising that this wicked kind of people will not pass away until the final judgment. So again, if we're dealing with a figurative generation, then you can read all these things as literally everything he talked about, and then you push that to the final judgment. This mirrors the enmity of the curse in Genesis 15. We talked about that. Structural split in the disciples' question. Your two-pronged approach matches the structure of Matthew 24, verse 3, where the disciples ask, near, when will these things, the temple destruction, happen? And far, what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? You see, this is the two-pronged question issue. Therefore, the answer is two-pronged. Many interpreters believe Jesus answers these separately. Under this framework, this generation in verse 34 applies strictly to the near fulfillment of 70 AD, while the far fulfillment, the second coming, remains in the day and hour that no one knows. Point 3. All these things as a historical process. The term panta tauta, all these things, can be read with a telescopic or typological lens. Representational all, similar to your Judea example, Matthew 24, verse 34, may use all to refer to the package of signs, the birth pains that began in the first century. Ingressive aorist. This is the issue, and I think this needs to be talked about much more because it's very interesting. Ingressive aorist. The Greek verb genetai, take place, can mean to begin to happen. To begin to happen. Thus, this generation will not pass away until all these things begin to take place, allowing the signs to start in AD 70 and continue through the church age. So, why is that significant? Well, it's actually very significant because there is an example of this already happening. And we can look in Luke 14, chapter 1, verse 14 through 20. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth. This is John the Baptist. For he will be great before the Lord, and he must not drink wine or strong drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even from his mother's womb. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. And he will go before him in the spirit of the power of Elijah, to turn their hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared. Now, this is already like his ministry. Pay attention. This is already his ministry and the things that he's going to do. And Zechariah said to the angel, how shall I know this? Sound familiar? What are the signs of these things? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years. And the angel answered, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. And behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place. Did you get it? Did you catch it? You will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place. Well, these things, are we talking about the ministry of John the Baptist, where he's, bringing people to the Lord and going in the power of Elijah and baptizing and all these things? Are we talking about that? Because you did not believe in my words, which will be fulfilled in their time. So do you see how this is qualified? These things until the day that these things takes place. Well, what this really should be translated as until these things begin to take place, because they are fulfilled in their time. Do you get it? This is the same kind of problem in Matthew 24, verse 34. So this should more accurately be translated to begin to take place. Otherwise, if you read this literally, it's a contradiction. It doesn't make sense. John the Baptist is not born and suddenly he's baptizing people. He's an infant. He has to grow up, then he has his mission, and so on and so forth. So Gabriel's prophecy is a very similar structure to what's going on here. Zechariah asks him, what are the sign? How am I going to know these things? And then, he's basically told this is what you're going to experience until these things begin to take place. Begin to take place should be the way. So, as usual, there is a translator bias when it comes to the Bible. Most people who translate the Bible are either preterist or dispensationalist or futurist, and that's a real problem. They're not historicists, and there's a consistent translation in all translations of this being past tense. So if we go back to, let's see, how can I get here? Matthew 24, 34. If we read this in different translations, 30, 34. Okay, 34. Until all these things take place. Okay, if you read it like in the KJV, till all these things be fulfilled. That's even worse. It gives you the sense like this is all, past tense. Young's literal translation. This generation may not pass till all these things may come to pass. That's a little different, but still gives you the sense that like this is like a done deal and all these things are going to take place before 70 AD, which is not true. The translation there could have been better done, and it could have been done in such a way that it says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things begin to take place. Doesn't that sound so much better and so much more harmonious with everything we've talked about? So, Luke 1 is a perfect example of this grammar in action. So that means we have a precedent for it happening in another place. This is not something we're making up. This is perfectly acceptable using the grammar, and it's perfectly harmonious with everything else. If you read all these things as literally all the things that he spoke of, and you read this generation, as literally the people in front of him, then your only choice in order to harmonize all these things and not have any contradictions is you must read these things or until as begin to take place. Do you get it? If you're going to stick to the literal generation view and the literal all these things view, meaning everything he's talked about, then you cannot read this as a past tense situation where it ends with the judgment of Jerusalem. Rather, you should read it as the beginning is with Jerusalem, and that makes sense. So you have several options, folks. You have several options. The conclusion with this is the following. As definite as this verse seems, meaning it's a nail in the coffin for historicism or whatever else, and a 100% win for Satan's little season or preterism, it's not. It's not as definite as people think it is, because there's always something deeper than surface value, because if you read it on surface value, you have contradictions. Plain and simple. There is a lot of flexibility here in the interpretation, and it can completely and easily be harmonized with everything else we've looked at from a historical perspective with dual fulfillments. It can very easily be harmonized in that way. There's different options, but historicism makes the most sense because it does not ignore the obvious worldwide impact and grandiose language that Jesus uses. He's not just speaking in exaggerations. He's speaking in grandiose language because this is very grandiose. There's a historical element to this. And it also doesn't ignore or invent some gap that dispensationalism creates, ignoring the immediate context of the people surrounding him, which is very obvious with the abomination of desolation and the judgment on 70 AD. So, therefore, my opinion is that there is flexibility and there are many possible interpretations. I gave you 4 of them based on the, which ways these things can go, whether they're literal or figurative. I will highlight them again so you can take note and you can see which one resonates with you the most. This is not something to be dogmatic about. It's not something to be dogmatic and fight, endless battles over, in the sense of, fighting over which one is more true than the others. They all can work in various ways. What we have to be dogmatic about is that you cannot read every single component, the 3 components, again, the generation component, all these things component, and begin to take place versus until to take place. You can't read all these things literally. You can't read that verse completely, literally, as it is on surface value. You can't. because there's something more going on. Obviously, from the very beginning, there's a two-pronged approach, which means that there's a deeper situation going on, meaning that this two-pronged near and far hermeneutic is baked into that verse. So it's has to be some balance of near and far in there in order to be reconciled with everything else. Otherwise, you have a problem. So that's the thing to be dogmatic about. As far as the different options, you have lots of flexibility and you can choose what works for you the most. I'll give you mine. But nevertheless, you cannot read this generation as only Jesus' generation and all these things as literally everything he just talked about and will be fulfilled as must be complete by 70 AD. You can't read it like that. That's the preterist view, that everything is completely done by 70 AD. You can't read it that way. It's not possible. There's no fulfillment. It doesn't work. It's irrational and it has contradictions. Dispensationalism is equally irrational. Therefore, the interpretation and the hermeneutic of these two things is wrong, and we have to apply a multi-layered approach using the historicist hermeneutic. So the main options are option number one, Jesus is talking to his generation, and when he says all these things, he's relating these things to the 70 AD judgment specifically. He doesn't mean everything he just talked about. He's just talking about the 70 AD judgment when he says these things. Option number two, Jesus is talking to his generation, and all these things is everything he just talked about up to that point, including both near and far fulfillments. But the translation should be read as will begin to take place, because this is the end of the age, and that's the final phase of history, and these are the things that are inaugurating this tribulation period and the end of the age. Okay, so it's a translation issue. Option number three, Jesus is talking to his generation, but all these things, in quotation marks, is idiomatic and doesn't mean literally everything he just talked about. Just like all the sick doesn't mean everyone in Judea, and he's still talking about will be fulfilled in 70 AD. That's still read as is. Option number four, Jesus is talking symbolically, and when he says this generation, he means this current age of generations, this age of people of wickedness is not going to expire until the very end. So all these things is everything he just talked about, near and far fulfillments. This generation is figurative, and will be fulfilled refers to the end of time, not 70 AD. Now, personally, where do I land? Well, I believe option number two is the best option. The translation error problem, or the translation, I wouldn't call it an error necessarily. I mean, probably could be translated much better. I don't think it's the most accurate translation. But nevertheless, option two is what I lean towards. I do not think it matters significantly which of these four views you hold, because either way you can make it harmonized with the historicist perspective. They're all possible. As long as you are not futurist or preterist, all of these things can be reconciled. So it's not super significant. However, my logic is the following. Most of the possibilities, when you map them out, involve this generation being the people in front of him. In other words, when you map all these out and say, okay, possibility one, possibility two, possibility three, and so on and so forth, most of those possibilities have to do, most of the combinations have to do with this generation being literally people in front of him, right? There's only one where the generation is like symbolic. So that's important, meaning very likely it's people in front of him that he's talking to when he says this generation. The apostles thought the end was near and it was time for the final judgment, so he was addressing their concerns, but also the bigger picture. And this explanation solves both, right? Because he's talking to the people in front of him, the apostles especially, and he's addressing the church age as well. And this option addresses both, because it says this generation of people is not going to pass away until these things begin to take place. All the things that I just talked to you about, both near and far fulfillments, these will begin to take place with the judgment on Jerusalem, which begins the tribulation and everything else. That harmonizes both the two-pronged answer very, very well. Option 1 and 3 are only relevant to 70 AD. So option 1 is Jesus is talking to his generation, and all these things are related to only just the things mentioned about the abomination of desolation. That's only relevant to the 70 AD judgment. It's very small scope, even though you can make it harmonized with the historicist hermeneutic. So I don't really think that's it, because there's a lot of big pictures in this chapter, very big ideas. Option 3 also Jesus is talking to this generation, but all these things is idiomatic, and it's more like all the sick that were mentioned. It's just an idiom. It's not literally everything you just talked about. Again, it's the same flavor as option one. He's talking only to his generation, doesn't really concern, the second aspect of that question. So I don't think that is the right way to go. Option 4 is also not the right way to go, even though it can be reconciled, because it's too symbolic. When you have this generation as a current age of people, of current generation of wicked people from now until the very end, this generation, this age, this generation of generations, right? A symbolic kind of generation. I think that's just way too symbolic, given the pressing needs of his audience, right? His apostles that were very dear to him were like, when are these things going to happen? What's going on? They're very concerned about the judgment. The people around him are listening, and they're very concerned about what's going to happen. There's a very pressing need to minister to these people. So I don't think that he would suddenly switch and say, by the way, this wicked generation of thousands of years is not going to pass away until I return. Well, yeah, obviously. That's just too obvious, and it's too open-ended. It's too, spiritual. So I think it's out of touch. Let's put it this way. I think it's out of touch. And Jesus is never out of touch. Jesus is always in touch with the people around him. And so I think that interpretation is just too out of touch given the pressing nature of the situation. So I think the only logical way to read this is that he's talking to his generation. He's talking to his generation when he says this generation. He's talking like, you guys will not pass away until all these things, I think everything he's talked about, because this is afterward, doesn't make sense that he would pick and choose when he's saying all these things, but you could justify it. You could. But I think given the situation, I think the most rational thing is that he's talking to the people in his circle, in his front of him. You guys will not pass away until all these things I just described will begin to take place. That seems to answer both questions. When is the sign of your coming? And when is the destruction of Jerusalem? Well, guess what? The destruction of Jerusalem is going to happen. And when that happens, it will begin the other signs. Do you get it? Because what you asked me is a two-pronged question that you don't realize is separated by thousands of years. So the answer I'm giving you is a very intelligent and clever answer, which solves the problem until all of these things begin to take place, which makes the most sense. So I think option 2 is the most logical by the process of elimination. Jesus was speaking to his generation. All these things refers to everything he just talked about because it's after what he just spoke. But the translation is the problem. As usual, there's always a translation issue. It should be read until these things begin to take place, meaning these things are going to start within the generation. You guys are going to experience the judgment, which is the beginning of this tribulation period, which is going to have lots of false Christs, and et cetera, which culminates in the sky opening and me arriving. But you don't know how long that time is going to be. This is just the beginning of that time. So don't worry about it. Worry about what's going to happen to you, which is the abomination of desolation and the judgment that you need to escape from. That, I think, is the most logical conclusion. There are many complexities in the Greek language that do not transfer over into English, and we know that because there's also a precedent for this in Luke 1, which is the same exact situation, where Gabriel says, until these things take place, but in fact, he just described all of John the Baptist's ministry, so it doesn't make sense if you're reading that literally, but the translation is the problem. It should be until these things begin to take place. So grammar allows for a more coherent translation. And if we translate it that way, until these things begin to take place, this is not making something up. It's not twisting Greek to suit our needs. It is a legitimate way because there's a precedent for it somewhere else, and there's a semantic range for the word to be interpreted that way. The problem is it was just never written down that way in English because of bias, probably, and tradition. The traditions that came before it, and people interpreting this as having to do just with the judgment in 70 AD, so they figured this is past tense rather than seeing it as a beginning to take place, which changes everything. It changes everything. So whichever view you hold to, it's okay. I'm not going to judge you for it, so long as you understand what is in the balance. If one thing is literal, like generation, then something else has to be idiomatic or specific or retranslated, etc. You have to balance these two. You can't read everything on face value with this verse because it leads to problems. If generation is symbolic, then other things can be literal and they remain as translated. If you want to read generation and all these things as literal, then you have to change the translation. That's my particular viewpoint. I think that's the most harmonious. I think it makes the most sense. It caters to the people in front of him. And it also answers the two-pronged question in the most elegant way. I think that's just the best explanation. Either way, there's a dance between literal and figurative. Preterism and Futurism do not have that dance because they look at everything through a very tiny little lens of all the Jews in the past, all the Jews in the future. That's it. And they ignore basically, historical context and immediate context and whatever else. Historicism is the only way to reconcile both the near and the far. And again, notice that God does this on purpose. He gives you these things to wrestle with. He gives you the dance because the people who go off the narrow road are not willing to hold these two perspectives in balance. The Bible has many things to say about doing things, following the commandments, having fruits of your faith, confirming your election, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, etc., etc., etc. Lots of other things to say about, guarantee of your salvation. You cannot be lost, etc., etc. These two things seem opposite, but they're given to you because there's a dance. There's a dance of life there. And that's on purpose, to really make you a mature and deep thinker. The same thing is with Matthew 24. God ordained that the apostles would ask him a two-pronged question, a question that required literal and figurative interpretation for the people that would read this. For the people in his present day, they were taken care of with the abomination of desolation. But for the people that would read it, which is most people in history, there's a two-pronged approach that you need to understand. And if you don't, you're deceived. So what does Matthew 24 begin with? See to it that nobody deceives you. Pay attention, because the devil's going to come up with preterism and futurism and dispensationalism and Satan's little season nonsense and all kinds of things to take you off the narrow road so that there is no dance. So anyway, preterism and futurism fail, and they cannot reconcile both perspectives. They can't. Historicism is the only way. Now, verse 36, nobody knows the day or the hour. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Now again, when he's speaking of day, he's speaking of the final judgment. So that means that these things are historically fulfilled, and we're talking big picture stuff. We're not talking about the Son doesn't know when 70 AD is happening. Do you get how silly that is? That Jesus wouldn't know when 70 AD is happening when he's actually telling them about the abomination of desolation. So obviously he knows when it's going to happen. Doesn't make sense, folks. Now, this is an important thing because this is another translation issue, and I've talked about it several times, many places. Unfortunately, the common interpretation of this is the subordinationist interpretation, and it influences a lot of people's eschatological views. Now, you have to reject that interpretation because Jesus says he's equal with the Father, and there's nothing, therefore, that the Father knows that Jesus doesn't. And Jesus is God. You have to honor Jesus as you do the Father, etc., etc. If you have the highest Christology, which you should, hopefully, especially if you watch this channel, then you believe that Jesus is the sovereign God of the universe. There's nothing that Jesus doesn't know. And you cannot read this statement as a subordinationist if you believe that Jesus is the sovereign God of the universe. There's nobody greater than Jesus. Jesus is God. Jesus is equal with the Father. Sadly, many Christians, even ones that are not Unitarians or subordinationists, read this verse as a subordinationist or Unitarian because they believe, or they read this literally and they say, well, not even the Son knows when he's returning. Only the Father knows. So don't try to guess end time stuff because not even Jesus knows, which of course is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. It's a translation problem because Jesus is not saying that he doesn't know the time of his return. He doesn't know the signs of his return when he's describing to you the signs of his return. That's not what it means. He's saying nobody is going to make it known to you other than the Father. Angels are not going to come to you and tell you when Jesus is returning. Not even Jesus himself is going to come and make it known to you. That's what it should be saying, not knows, but rather make it known. And the reason we know this is, again, a quirky behavior in Greek language. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2, Paul says, "For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." To know nothing doesn't mean he decided literally to wipe his memory clean and to know nothing except this. Rather, the meaning that is conveyed in this sentence is, I decided to make known nothing among you other than just the gospel. I was very focused, very pure. I didn't waste my time on endless babble. I spoke to you just the gospel. I decided to make known to you nothing except the gospel. That's what this is. And that wording is in the same kind of wording that's used in verse 36. So if we go back to verse 36, he says, "But concerning that day and hour, no one makes it known, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." Now that's a very different situation, a very, very different situation. So Jesus is not literally saying, nobody knows, not even me. Don't even try to guess all this end time stuff, even though I spent lots of time giving you signs to watch for and told you many parables to watch and gave you Revelation by John, Revelation by Daniel, 2 Thessalonians by Paul, etc. I gave you all that information, but don't try to guess the end times, folks. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying that at all. What he's saying is something much more profound, which is that do not believe an angel, an angelic visitation, even a vision that you think is from me that says I'm returning on X date or time. That's what he's really saying. Why? Because false Christs, false prophets, etc., are decreed for this tribulation period. Do you see how this all makes sense? Again, it comes back to the same stuff. It's a historically fulfilled situation. If he is saying that he doesn't know, and you're reading this as a subordinationist, he doesn't know, after he spent the whole chapter giving people signs of his coming, it is completely inconsistent. It's also completely inconsistent with the Christology of the New Testament. Now, if you are a Unitarian or a subordinationist that denies the Trinity in any single way, you're going to stumble over that interpretation. Because for you, reading that naturally, as the Son doesn't know what the Father knows, that's a very natural thing for you if you're a Unitarian or a subordinationist. But that's not true. Because if Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, it is the will of the Father that you honor the Son as you do the Father. I and the Father are one. If you've said these things, then the Christology of the New Testament is the highest possible Christology. The people who wrote about God, or who wrote about Jesus, believed he was God in the flesh, the absolute God, the Yahweh made flesh. There's nobody higher than Jesus. Jesus is the God made flesh. That means the reading that he doesn't know something that the Father knows is wrong. And you have to get around that. So please watch my Trinity series, a series that not too many people have watched, unfortunately. But nevertheless, the devil uses this subordinationist interpretation to make you stop thinking and to not watch. Do you get it? Jesus gave parables of being watchful. He gave warnings to not be deceived. And what does the devil do? He tries to get you to read this as a subordinationist, and therefore, well, don't try to guess the end times. Don't any kind of end time speculation. Nobody knows the day or the hour. How many people have cited to me this verse? Nobody knows the day or the hour. Even the elect will be deceived. So many foolish interpretations. Nobody knows the day or the hour, so we shouldn't do anything with end times, even though God has given us plenty of end times texts to study. Why? See, I have told you beforehand. Doesn't make sense. If he's telling you on one hand, I've told you beforehand, and on another hand, he's saying, don't try to guess anything because nobody knows the day or the hour. That is nonsense. So you need to get out of this interpretation hermeneutic because it's wrong. In fact, God has given us countless signs and prophecies to be watchful, parables. This entire chapter is, and the one afterward, is about being watchful and not being deceived. So the devil doesn't want you to be watchful. He wants you to be a foolish virgin that will be deceived. And so he twists the word of God to present a false interpretation. If you can be deceived into believing that nobody knows the day or the hour, so might as well not do anything with eschatology because nobody can really know the truth, right? I mean, it's just so confusing. If you can believe that, then you can go, just check out and all these things can happen in front of you, and you'll be deceived by what's coming. That's the point, is to make you mentally check out of not paying attention. That's been the strategy since day one. The Jesuits started Preterism and Futurism to take your attention off of history. So you're looking over here, looking over there, and meanwhile, the devil is working his empire in plain sight and bringing his new world order into fulfillment. So the devil doesn't want you to pay attention, and this is the problem. And on top of this, another hook that the devil has in you, if you interpret this and you truly believe that there's something that the Son doesn't know that the Father knows, you have accepted a subordinationist view of Jesus, whether you are openly subordinationist or Unitarian or not. If you are a Trinitarian, you cannot read this from that perspective. It is inconsistent for you to do that. It is inconsistent for you to be a Trinitarian in the true sense of the word, not in a monarchical view or some other weird view, but a true sense of the mystery, where you have one God, one being existing multi-personally in three persons, simultaneously, co-equal, co-eternal, co-ruling, triune monarchy. I talk about all that stuff in my Trinity series. You can't have that view, which is a mystery, and read this, which is not a mystery. Well, the Son, doesn't know anything, or doesn't know the most important human or date in human history, but the Father knows. That doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense, folks. Doesn't make sense. You can't have that if you're a Trinitarian. So this is the problem, because if you believe that, the next step for you is to, well, maybe the subordinationists are right. Maybe the Unitarians are right. Oh, maybe all that Torah keeping stuff is right. Maybe the legalists are right. And little by little, the devil gets you. Do you see how that works? So this is a double mistake. So what does it mean? Well, if nobody's going to tell you when Jesus returns, that means only the Father is going to tell you when Jesus returns. And how does the Father work? Well, the Father works by granting awareness. When Peter recognized the Christ, and Jesus said, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven has revealed this to you." Has revealed, right? Revealed. He just, in your mind, suddenly you're awake and you see that. And that's how the Father communicates to his elect children various truths at different times. And as we get closer and closer to the end, God will reveal more and more. If you are the patient, wise virgin, waiting in anticipation, watching the signs, listening, being studious, being a Berean, being a Fennec fox with big ears, waiting, watching, God is going to reveal these things as we get closer and closer and closer. God is revealing things every day to the watchful. To the ignorant, they're not getting anything. They're going to get deceived. So be watchful and understand that, yes, these things will be revealed, but only the Father is going to reveal them to you. The Father is transcendent. This is a very important point, folks. When Jesus says the angels are not going to reveal it to you, even the Son is not going to reveal it to you. Well, you know that angels exist, right? Angels have a corporeal form. People have seen angels. People have seen the Son because the Son has been manifest in history. So you could have a vision of the Son and claim that the Son came to you and told you these things. But nobody's seen the Father. Do you get it? The Father is transcendent. Of course, Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. But the point is, nobody has seen the Father directly. He's not observable. And so there's the transcendent aspect of God that is revealing that to you. Meaning, you're not going to get a visitation from an angel. You're not going to get a visitation even from Jesus. You're not going to get a dream. Nothing carnal is going to reveal to you when Jesus is returning. Do you get it? You're going to have awareness that suddenly shifts in your mind. And you test it with Scripture and you realize, okay, that is from God. So God is revealing these things to me as we go along. But you're not going to have some supernatural sign, which is what people love to have. And of course, people go after false prophets like Ellen White, Joseph Smith, and so many others since then that claim to have had visitations from Jesus that told them all these various things, which of course they weren't seeing Jesus, they were seeing Satan masquerading as Jesus. So this is the problem, folks. They all claim to hear from Jesus or even angels or whatever else, and they were all proven wrong. Ellen White is a plagiarist. She's had plenty of things wrong. She had some good things to say, but I think it was more of it was revealing the method, to be quite honest with you, the more I've studied her life. So you can learn more about that in my Adventism series. But the Father works in mysterious ways. He grants awareness. He changes things internally inside of you. As time moves forward, he reveals things to us one step at a time. For example, just in the last 2 years, I've learned a lot that I didn't know when I made my End Time series in 2023. And of course, I've published other videos on top of that to evolve to document my evolving understanding. But as time moves on, God is going to reveal more of the picture to us. There are things that I don't know. For example, I've given my best educated guess that I think that we have until 2034. As we get closer to 2034, that will become clearer whether I'm right or wrong. Again, I'm not setting a date. I'm not setting a time. I'm not saying Jesus came to me and gave me that vision. I'm just saying, based on history and scripture and me watching everything that I'm watching, I don't see this going longer than 2034. I could be wrong. As I get closer, let's say 2028, 2029, 2030, 2031, okay, maybe we have like 5 more years, 10 more years. Maybe we have less than that. Maybe it's coming up. You never know. So these things will be revealed as time moves on. I didn't see, for example, the conversion of the Jews until like a year and a half ago. And initially I was fighting dispensationalism with my End Time series because dispensationalism was making everybody froth at the mouth. But then I realized they have to collapse dispensationalism and the Jews are going to be converted. I didn't realize that until later. God showed me that in his word, in his reading and looking at history. I believe that was from God because I didn't just figure that out. Same thing with the two-party narrative, how they're collapsing the two-party narrative and breeding a synthesis that's going to make all of the candidates in 2028 Catholic social teaching candidates, because Catholic social teaching is the thing that will rescue America from the false hopes that they had with Trump and MAGA and failed nationalism. Catholic social teaching will come in to rescue the day. I didn't see that, I don't know, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. I knew what Catholic social teaching was. I knew about the Catholic Church, but I didn't see all of that angle with the Catholic Church. Especially, we didn't see the angle because the new Pope was American, and at the time it was Pope Francis, right? So I wasn't sure what's going to happen after Pope Francis. I thought, well, maybe Pope Francis is such a liberal that the next one's going to be like super conservative, and that's going to be totally justified. When in fact, the next one was a middle of the road kind of guy. It's time for the synthesis. I didn't see that. Now I see it very clearly. So God reveals these things as we go through time. And again, the revelations happen in your mind, in reading the word, watching history, not from supernatural visitations. That is the point of verse, 36, I think? Was it 36? Yeah, verse 36. That is the point of verse 36. Not that Jesus doesn't know when he's arriving, so don't try to figure things out. That is the dumbest interpretation you can have. It's really dumb because you're ignoring everything he just gave you to be watchful and the signs and so on. So don't buy into it. And if you're a Unitarian or subordinationist, then come out of that, because Unitarianism is a fallacy. And I don't think that you can be considered a Christian if you deny the deity of Christ. I just don't see how that's possible. I don't. Maybe it's possible, but in my book, I don't see how that's possible. There are errors. It's one thing to be a dispensationalist. It's another thing to be a Unitarian and deny the deity of Christ, because the only option you have when you do that, historically, is to become a legalist, is to become a synergist, is to rely on your own efforts, free will salvation, losing your salvation. You have no assurance, you have no gospel, you have a false gospel. I've never in my life, and I never will, meet a monergistic Unitarian. It's not possible, because if you trust in God's sovereignty, there's no way that you can deny the deity of Christ. And on the reverse, if you have the highest possible Christology, that Jesus Christ is God, the Yahweh made flesh, that saves everyone that he has chosen to save absolutely and for his name's sake, and he is completely effective at what he does because he's God, made in the flesh, resurrected, ruling in heaven right now, amillennial historicism. If you believe that, there's no way you can become a Unitarian. There's no way. So it's a double-edged sword, I suppose. Nevertheless, God is going to give you the sense, not an angel, not a vision from Jesus, not a dream, but an awareness, a change in your mind that's supernatural, but nevertheless something very light and subtle and intimate in the secret place. Now, let's move on. 37 through 39. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Very, very important verses. Unfortunately, a lot of people go wild and froth at the mouth for crazy Nephilim conspiracy theories that the jib-jabs have given people Nephilim DNA, and there will be Nephilim walking around the earth, and the Pleiadians, and all of this kind of stuff. Notice, please, notice how the wrong interpretations always look at things through carnal eyes. They look at low-hanging fruit, they look at what's obvious, they look carnally rather than seeing with spiritual eyes, and using things like nuance and balance and seeing the mystery and so on and so forth. The context always solves the problem, folks. The context is what? As were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Meaning you have a parallel situation, you have a comparison. Two things are being compared, the flood judgment and the final judgment, which of course the flood is a typological judgment of. How were those days? What is the thing that Jesus is comparing? Well, he tells you they were eating and drinking and giving in marriage, and they were unaware. That's the comparison. He doesn't say, as were the days of Noah, so will be the days of the coming of the Son of Man. There were giants in the earth of those days, and they were killing everybody, and that's how the giants are going to be again at the end. No. They were eating and drinking and giving in marriage, and they were unaware. Same thing in Luke 21, by the way. Same thing, but in the days of Lot. So, in other words, people before the final judgment will be completely oblivious to Jesus' return and to the signs of the times. They will be completely oblivious. They will see the persecution of others, just like they see, for example, ICE and all of the shenanigans going on today. Again, whether you agree with that or not doesn't matter. The cold-heartedness of the people is measurable. And when they start persecuting people for not bowing down to this Catholic New World Order, the people who are in that system will think that nothing is wrong. So therefore, they will be completely oblivious to the judgment that's coming upon them. The people who know that this is wrong have either already repented and they're running away from the beast, or they're in that system and they realize, you know what, this is wrong. I refuse to bow down to the system. I don't agree with it. I'm repenting and getting out of this system. They will repent, they will see the signs of the times, and they will come out of this system. But either way, they will have awareness. The people who are not aware, just like the people in the flood, will be swept away in judgment. So people will be very oblivious because there's going to be a false peace. Now, people were oblivious because their times were very prosperous in the flood. They were eating and drinking and giving in marriage. Those are signs of prosperity. People are going to be oblivious again at the very end because why? Because there's a time of prosperity. Because they've taken the mark. Do you get it? They're in the system. They're not getting persecuted. They're eating and drinking and giving in marriage. They're participating in society. Life is good for them. They're in the golden age of false peace, false security, and then, as Paul says, sudden destruction comes upon them. Most people today think that we need to conquer the obvious evils of society, like communism, Islam, Zionism, so we can vote the devil out, quote unquote, vote the deep state out by rebelling to tyranny. Yet this is the biggest trap there is, folks. That's the final initiation into the false light world system. The true New World Order is not going to be Muslim. It's not going to be Islamic. It's not going to be, I already said that, Muslim, Zionist, or communist. It's going to be Christian, counterfeit Christian. But it's going to be Christian. It's going to appear lamb-like, and it's going to appear that it cares for your freedom and your religious tolerance and prosperity and peace. And most people are going to be deceived and take the bait, which is why they're going to be eating and drinking and giving in marriage. The elect who will be persecuted will be dealing with persecution until Jesus returns. So they're going to be watchful and realizing that the time is nigh. So this is not about Nephilim returning or some supernatural reading. It is expressly explained and defined to you because the comparison is that they were enjoying themselves right before the judgment, meaning they were participating in society. That means that the destination of history and all the tribulation, despite all the warnings and false Christs and false prophets and the love growing cold and all this stuff going on, and earthquakes and wars, despite all that, the end of this tribulation period is a period of false peace and false security and prosperity. Do you get it? The end, right before Jesus' return, this tribulation period with deception ends how? It ends with a false peace where people are eating and drinking and giving in marriage. You don't do that if there's tribulation. But what if tribulation doesn't mean just being persecuted? What if tribulation means very high deception and spiritual delusion that culminates in the maximum deception, where people are deceived into disobeying God and believing that being lawless is actually God's will for their life. So despite all these tribulations, the false light system is the final culmination of this, and this is what Jesus is warning about. Now, I'm going to take a quick break for the bathroom because I drank a lot of water before presenting this, and now it's wanting to come out. So we'll be right back. Okay, we're back now for this next section of people being taken. This is verse 40 through verse 51. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. Now notice this is right after the comparison of the final judgment. So we're at the end of time. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. The 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready. Stay awake, be ready, don't be deceived. For the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over this household, to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find doing so when he arrives. Truly, I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, dispensationalists love these verses about people being taken and one being left to support their rapture theology, which of course is false. The rapture is very false. I have a whole episode on that in my End Time series. This is not about the righteous being swooped away. It's actually about the wicked being swooped away. Because again, consider the following. In the days of Noah, the wicked were the ones who were swept away with the flood, not the righteous. You have the parable of the 2 servants, which is right after this, where the wicked servant is thrown out into the place of torture and death. You have the parable of the wedding feast in Matthew 22, where the impostor is taken and thrown out. And they said to him, friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment? And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. So bind him, take him, and throw him out. The parable of the tenants in the chapter afterwards in Matthew 25, and cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So somebody's taken and they're cast outside of, where the action's at. Earlier in Matthew 25, this is the parable of the virgins. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he answered, truly, I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the hour nor the day. Again, be watchful, stay awake. Later in chapter 25, the goats are destroyed. This is verse 46. Yeah. And the goats will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. So you have a consistent theme. There are many warnings to stay awake, to not be deceived. There are warnings around the final judgment. So there's a lot of themes of the final judgment and the wicked being destroyed and being swept away in judgment. The wicked are swept away because they are ignorant of these things and are not awake. Do you get it? They're swept away because they are not awake. They have no consciousness of Jesus' return or Bible prophecy or whatever else. They are completely surprised, like a thief in the night. The people being taken away here are the wicked, and the language is very hyperbolic. It's very extreme. It's not literally half and half. In other words, half people are saved, half people are wicked. It's just hyperbole in the sense that, that person next to you grinding at the mill could be a wicked reprobate. So, confirm your election. Be awake. These are, do you get the literary device that Jesus is using to put some fire under your butt to basically pay attention and be watchful, be intentful, like a bride bridesmaid waiting for the groom to come for the party, for the groom party. They're waiting, they're listening, their ears are out. Everything is very attentive. You have to have that anxiousness, not in a like a fear kind of way, but in like a desiring anxiousness. Otherwise, you're going to be surprised. And Paul says that we are not going to be surprised like a thief in the night because we're paying attention. But the wicked will be surprised like a thief in the night, and that's the whole point. So stay awake because the wicked are going to be swept away in judgment, and you don't know who the wicked are. Of course, you can see some of them based on their fruits, but you don't know, so confirm your election, stay awake. It's not going to be exactly 50-50 because there's more wicked than righteous by far in history. But the point is hyperbole. It's exaggerated language designed to make you pay attention because that person next to you could be swept away in judgment. And you're there grinding and, you're not swept away in judgment. So it's very close in that sense, right? It's a very intimate situation. Of course, there's no condemnation for the elect, so there's nothing to be afraid of, but rather just be attentive. It's not designed for you to go and judge the salvation of others and say, oh, that person's elect, that person's not elect. No, the point is to make you look within and to test yourself, to test your own actions, your own life, and therefore be alert and watchful. Because the elect will respond to these words and say, oh, I need to be alert and watchful. This sounds like really serious stuff. And it will fulfill God's words, and they will be alert and watchful, and they will not be deceived. The elect will respond to these words, and they will pay attention. They will be the wise virgins. The wicked are not going to respond. They're not going to care. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 9 through 12, it says, the coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders. Does this match what Jesus said in Matthew 24? Yes, absolutely. And with all wicked deception for those who are perishing because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. They refuse to love the truth. They don't love the truth. They don't care. They love whatever the world is doing. Therefore, God sends them strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that they may be condemned, who did not believe in truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. They took pleasure in the counterfeit. The counterfeit is just, they love those traditions. They love all that counterfeit nonsense, counterfeit mystery. And as a result, God lets them be judged by Satan. Satan is the vehicle of judgment, and he deceives them into their destruction. And then God judges everyone at the end. So, parable of the two servants, parable of the tenants also suggests this is about the church age. Again, these are broad strokes in time. This advice of the servant taking care of the other servants is for all people throughout the church age. Who is the one who's going to give the people their food at their proper time? Who is the one that's going to minister to others and be part of God's plan? Who is the one who's abusing the servants, i.e. all these false prophets, false Christs, et cetera, and they're going to be judged. It doesn't make any sense that all of these parables given are about being watchful and tending to God's business if it only applies to the 40 years between 31 AD, 70 AD. It doesn't make any dang sense at all. No sense. Preterism fails over and over again. It also doesn't make sense if we're just talking about the final generation, where suddenly Jesus is saying, who's the faithful and wise servant for these 7 years in history that's going to give everybody their fruit of their property? It doesn't make any damn sense. It really doesn't. You have to get out of these views and see the true view, which is historicism. These things are historically fulfilled, and the advice is for generations upon people to read this and say, am I the faithful servant or am I the wicked servant? And to look within and test your election and then respond accordingly. So, again, Futurism and Preterism fail horribly because the Bible is meant to be historically interpreted. Now, with that, final thoughts. I want to read you something from Isaiah 26, 7 through 8. The path of the righteous is level. You make level the way of the righteous. In the path of your judgments, O Yahweh, we wait for you. Your name and remembrance are the desire of our soul. We wait for you, God. We wait for God, and we will trust that God will provide whatever we need until the very end. I hope that you learned something today, hope something new, or if you already knew all these things, great, then refreshed your memory. Probably you didn't know about the translation issue with the verse 34. I know I didn't. But whether you are a seasoned Fennec fox or just a noob little fox like the one in the hand that's very cute that I use, I hope that you got something out of today. Matthew 24 is one of the key prophetic texts of the end times, and it is also from Jesus directly. Of course, they're all from Jesus ultimately, but it's from Jesus directly, which is very important. There's very complex realities in this text because you have a dualistic perspective. You have a dance between two things. You have a relevance to the people in front of him and a relevance to the rest of the people throughout the church age, which is a very complex situation. If someone asked you to explain 2,000 years of history while also making it completely relevant for the people in front of you, how would you do it? Well, that's a good question. I don't think you could do it. Only God could do such a thing, and do it so poetically, mind you. So God decreed that the apostles, in their panic, would ask like 3 questions in one, basically, and a loaded question, not realizing that those are multiple issues, so that Jesus could then respond and give revelation to everyone, both present and not present, which is really brilliant. Again, you have to see things from God's perspective. Just like, again, Jesus decreed Peter to ask him about the question of how many times he should forgive, only to respond, Jesus responding, with the parable of the unforgiving servant. That was a decree by God so that God could reveal something very profound about forgiveness. So God decreed that Peter would get frustrated and ask a very selfish question so that Jesus could then knock it out of the park with a brilliant parable. In the same way, Jesus sets this situation up. They're by the buildings. God is in control with all that situation. They're by the buildings. He lets them point it out. He said, oh, by the way, did you know that all this is going to be destroyed? What? This is going to be destroyed? Oh, let me ask you a bunch of these questions. Now Jesus can reveal. It's all done like this, folks. God is the one setting these things up so that he can knock it out of the park every time. It's all about God. And if you have a God-centered view of salvation, a God-centered view of the scriptures, then all of this will make sense to you very plainly, because it's about God. It's not about man first. It's about God first. We have to put ourselves in his perspective and think big on multiple levels simultaneously. Remember that God cares for all of his children throughout history, not just a bunch of children, a handful of children in the past or a handful of children in the future. He cares about all of his people throughout history. Therefore, what he says works on multiple levels simultaneously. And that's very important. And that truth, of course, is summarized in the amillennial historicist position, which I think, again, is the most consistent because it's Jesus ruling right now. While he's ruling, Satan has been thrown down to the earth. There's the tribulation. He's causing havoc. God is putting all of his enemies under his feet one at a time. And of course, Satan and death are reserved for the end. It's a tumultuous time with persecutions, natural disasters, great deception throughout the age, especially at the end. And that age culminates in maximum spiritual deception dressed up as the will of God, and prosperity and false peace for those people who are willing to participate in that system right before destruction. And that period began, very long period, began with the events following the cross and eventually the judgment of the Jews in 70 AD. That's a very consistent position. I'm not stretching anything. It's very consistent with history. It's very consistent with the rest of the eschatological texts. All of this is very internally consistent and simple without having to do any gymnastics with any verses. I don't do any gymnastics with these verses. These are very consistent, but I acknowledge that there's multiple fulfillments. That's the answer. Otherwise, you have to do gymnastics, whether you're a dispensationalist or preterist or whatever else. And by the way, I don't need to invent some imaginary Satan's little season period to explain the tribulation and evil increasing in the world and deception being at a maximum. I don't need that. I don't. My worldview on this explains it very plainly without having to invent some magical period that doesn't exist. In all of my years of teaching dance and having been a professional dancer, if something felt awkward in movement and unnatural, then it was probably wrong. It was probably wrong. There's a difference between something being hard but natural and something being just awkward. And if you've done any kind of movement or whatever movement practice, whether it's martial arts or dancing or sport, you know that when something is awkward, it's just awkward. Something's not right about this. And if it's natural, then it's right. And the same thing is with this. Good dancing is supposed to be easy and natural. It could be challenging for sure, even if it takes effort, but it's supposed to be easy and natural. The same, I believe, is with the truth. It may take effort to wrestle with. It may take a little effort, a little studying, a little action, but it should come naturally and be simple and harmonious with everything else. Very harmonious. This is a very harmonious way to look at things through the amillennial historicist perspective. So, I hope that you've learned something new today about Matthew 24. Excuse me. I hope that you also share this with voices going nuts. I hope you share this with others as well. Because a lot of people are being deceived by preterism, Satan's little season, dispensationalism, all kinds of deceptions in fulfillment of Christ's words in this chapter. So share it with them and help them come out of those deceptions. The world is soon going to be deceived by the counterfeit of Christianity, the Catholic social teaching, New World Order. And there's not much time left. I don't really believe there's that much time. I believe that there's, again, 2034 is my watch, my ultimatum, and then we'll see as we get closer to that. But whether I'm right or not, you can sense that there's something about history that is wrapping up. You can sense that. There's not much more that we can go with the way things are going. With everything from financial collapse to technology to deceptions, there's not much more that it can go, folks. There's not much more that it can go. So get right with God if you haven't. If you're watching this and you haven't gotten right with God, then get right with God, because God is returning to the earth. If you don't believe in God, if you are an atheist, if you are, whatever, Unitarian, if you are Muslim, if you're Jewish, whatever, get right with God. And the way to do that is to repent and to believe in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, as God who paid for your price, because your price is your life. And if you don't accept that price, if you don't walk in obedience to that price, then, you'll have to pay it one way or another. Somebody has to pay. So get right with God. And if you are already right with God, then learn the truth on these things and help others come out of deception, because this is connected to a lot of other deceptions. And all those deceptions are being cashed in by the devil simultaneously to bring in this new world system, which is really the old world system that's always been around. But people are going to participate in it and believe that it's something new and good. And we've conquered the deep state. We've conquered the evil darkness of Zionism and communism and liberalism and Islam. And now we're finally in a Christian world order and everything's going to be great, and so on and so forth. When in fact, when they say peace and safety, sudden destruction will come upon them. So don't be one of those people that it takes them over like a thief in the night. Be watchful. Be a watchful virgin. Be awake. Be a Fennec fox with big ears, paying attention and listening. I think it's a great symbol for discernment. And hope you learned something. We'll see you next time. Take care and God bless.